Okay, there we go. Thanks and welcome to the May meeting of the Save Our Indian River Lagoon Citizen Oversight Committee. So with that, I'll call us to order and we'll begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, if we could go through roll call.
Bryan Cost.
Here.
Charles Dudai.
Here.
Amy Toronto.
Here.
Don is not here. John is not here. Terry Casto.
Here.
Bobby Putnam.
Here.
Laura Lee Thompson.
Here.
Stephanie is also not here. And Kimberly is not here. Todd.
Here.
Kurt Smith. Here. And Barbara Scanlon.
Here.
Okay,
We do have a quorum.
thank you. And with that, we'll move on to approval of the agenda. Any changes, Virginia? Okay, I'll take a motion to approve the agenda.
Motion to approve.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Hearing none. All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Passes unanimously. We have an agenda. So approval of the minutes. You have the
Motion to approve.
Second.
Any discussion? I have a motion and agenda. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All opposed, like sign? Passes unanimously. We'll move on to progress and fiscal reports. Monthly progress report, Virginia?
Good morning. Since this is the quarterly reporting month, I'm going to skip around on the monthly progress report and just present the things that won't come up in the quarterly. So under work completed this month, University of Central Florida did vegetation monitoring at McNabb Park. Some of that vegetation had been in place for 3 months and some for 6 months, but the survival was over 81%. So that's really good for plant survival. We're pleased with that so far. And you'll recall those are the ones where they did those sort of hanging baskets off the side of the seawall. So some is mangroves and some is marsh grasses. The state legislature has sent the budget to the governor. I provided a handout that itemizes the items that we have in that budget that's gone. We're waiting to see what the governor does or doesn't do with his veto pen, but we did exceedingly well. Our delegation worked hard for us on a number of projects, and so the ones at the top 5 are ones that are coming directly to our office. They sum to $23.3 million for 3 muck dredging projects and septic to sewer project and upgrading conventional septic tanks to advanced septic. Then there are 3 utility infrastructure projects that are county infrastructure projects. The next set are city projects that were also funded. 2 of those are projects that are also receiving SORL funding the Palm Bay septic to sewer conversions, and the Melbourne Espanola baffle box. And then there are 2 NGO bits of funding at the bottom, one for Sebastian Inlet and one for the Kilroy monitoring systems. You know, those are the continuous monitoring stations that we fund for. This funds, there are 8 or 9 in Brevard County, so some of those are funded by the state, and this is continuing maintenance for those. And then I also went through the 500-page budget and found a few other things that I thought would be of interest. The Blue Crab Cove is our working waterfront. It's on the list to receive $890,000 to upgrade Miss Apple's crab house. So we're looking forward to that. The Brevard Zoo Aquarium is in there for $2 million for the Dwayne DeFreeze Coastal Conservation Hub. Cocoa Beach High School Ecology Restoration Program is receiving funding for standing up an aquaculture program to support the lagoon, which is really, really exciting. And then in addition to the funding for Kilroy's, there was also funding for Harbor Branch has Lobo systems that are also continuous monitoring stations, so they're receiving funding for continuous water quality monitoring in the lagoon. Then you may have also seen the headlines about $100 million for the lagoon. That's in addition to all of these individual projects, so we don't have any details yet on how that $100 million would be divided up between the various counties, municipalities, water management districts, DEP. We'll hope, look forward to receiving more information about that later. There's also $4.9 million for the Restore Inflow project. That's the one that Florida Tech has led for several years, looking at pumping water in, doing a pilot project to pump water in from the ocean and see how that modifies water conditions in the lagoon and benthic response in the area of the pumping. My understanding is that this 4.9 will be shared somehow between UCF, will do oversee the actual construction of the pilot system, and Florida Tech will continue monitoring the benthic and water quality response. And then there was $250,000 for the National Estuary Program.
Virginia, I think we have a quick question.
Yeah, with the FIT one, do you know if they're going to be doing anything to look at the impact of that already in the Mosquito Lagoon from the Canaveral National Seashore? Because I know they had a lot come over the shoreline into the lagoon after the storm, and I'm hearing they still are at certain tides. So I was just curious if that might be included into looking at that impact, since it's also natural.
Right. I'm not aware of that, but it's a really good suggestion.
Thank you.
Okay.
Virginia, just
Yes.
help me out with a math. What's the total of Mayfield's bill? 20-some million you itemized for us, but what's the rest of all that add up to? You got a quick answer?
No,
Okay, I can
do
do
not.
it later, thanks.
37.
Just under 37 million.
So, and that's what was listed in her newsletter. But like I said, there were these other projects that also support the lagoon that weren't in her newsletter. So, and I'm
But that's separate, is that separate legislation? This is one package, right?
No, the vast majority of these are going to be state budget, so it's a variety of programs.
There are line items in the budget, so each one of these had a separate House bill and Senate bill.
Each one of these line items?
Yes, that's the way the process works, yes.
Civics.
Yeah.
Virginia, I'll let you finish. I had a question too, but I'll wait.
I was going to move on to not funding.
Oh, okay, real quick
wanna
on the
talk about
funding.
funding.
The two projects that did have Sorrel, the Palm Bay Septic and the Melbourne Espanola, so the funds that they got, was that part of their initial matching when they applied, or was this on top of that? I guess the question I'm asking is because I think we had in there that said if they receive additional grant funds, then the money that we were going to give them then can go to another lagoon project or something?
If they receive additional funds, they need to let us know and modify one of the forms that we request from them monthly. And depending on, how much the project costs and how much those costs have changed, that will determine whether they have savings or we have savings. Certainly, we have gotten savings from some projects when they were able to get enough state
More
funding
funding.
or other grant funding to offset everything that they had requested from us. They also, we want all of our partners to go try to,
Get that grant
secure,
money.
leverage additional funds. And so one of the things that incentivizes that is that when they make the effort to go get other funding, the portion of the project that's paid for by that funding, they get those BMAP credits for meeting their state mandated nutrient load reductions.
Great, thank you.
Any additional funding questions before we move on?
I have a question about the work completed, but I can wait till the end of your report.
Okay. There's also a 10-year Florida seagrass restoration plan in the budget that the governor would have DEP stand up a seagrass restoration program. And Senate Bill 1632 includes the Indian River Lagoon Protection Program. I distributed the language of that bill last month, but that was in the final package. So we're waiting to hear if that is approved and how that will be implemented. Then moving on from state issues back to local issues, 4 more derelict vessels have been removed, and the O Galley muck dredging project, we received multiple responses to the RFQ and have selected a consultant. So we'll be finalizing the bid documents for that and hoping to get that project bid before the end of the year. And that's really all I wanted to highlight.
Any additional questions?
Yes, the Senate Bill 1632, is that the one in regard to wastewater? Because,
It's a 90-page bill, and it includes a whole lot. There's a lot for spring sheds, but for the Indian River Lagoon program, it requires a lot of septic to sewer. We have to evaluate all developments, 50 lots or more, with the lot size less than an acre, both existing lots and future development
right,
lots.
so I was going to ask, is that significant? Because when they say, so the bill requires that they be evaluated. So is that going to make a significant difference?
Having
in
that
terms of-
evaluation?
Yeah, I mean, so it's any community of more than 50 homes,
Yes.
less than an acre in size?
Yes.
So that could cover a lot of ground, but I'm just wondering, how big are the teeth in it? if
Right, so we
the
have no
language-
information on how the state would implement that language yet, but I would think that going through that evaluation process would identify areas of significant loading and look at the impacts of allowing that loading to continue versus connecting them to sewer.
Okay, and that's by 2030, wasn't it?
There were parts there were multiple deadlines in there. There
I
were
think
some
that
that was
one's 2030.
2025. I think the evaluation has to be done by 2025, and then implementation in 2030 and 2032. There's also no more conventional septic permits in the Indian River Lagoon watershed. And I think that's like effective July 1 or January 1. And then there's also a requirement to upgrade everybody from conventional to the nitrogen reducing, 65% nitrogen reducing. And I asked the state staff how that is going to be implemented, and they have received no direction on that yet.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but both that in the prohibition on conventional septic and the prohibition on conventional septic and that upgrade to nutrient removal was specific to several BMAP areas, including the lagoon, and then the 50 lot was statewide. I'm pretty sure the 50 lot is statewide. The 50 lot planning requirement is statewide.
Okay. Yeah, there's
So-
sections that are specific to spring sheds,
Yep.
there's sections that are to impaired waters, and then there's sections that are for the lagoon specifically. And so the portions that are specific to the lagoon, I believe, are as comprehensive as any of the other sections, so I didn't.
More so.
Right.
That was my point.
Right.
The 50 lot is statewide, and it does not have the same teeth as the lagoon sections. It is not as much of a mandate because, again, the lagoon area is a much more sensitive area than many areas of the state. And so that was part of the discussions with that particular language in the bill to require it as a planning requirement because it was applicable statewide. So I think this legislation is very impactful. And so, Virginia, could you and I work together to maybe provide just a summary of that at an upcoming meeting so that we can get into the details? Because I think it is significant enough to the work that we're doing and of interest enough both to the committee and the public that walking through a few of those, just highlighting those details. I don't know that would have to be a real long presentation, but it's something that we could walk through and just highlight some of those specifics so that we've got good clarity on exactly what that accomplishes.
Okay, and if anybody's interested in the meantime, you can Google Senate Bill 1632 and pull up the PDF of the text.
Yeah, there's a lot of intertwined pieces, so I think it'll be helpful to try to navigate that for the group.
I just have one more quick question. In regard to the McNabb Park, how much is that a good model for, were there particular characteristics of that area that make it more suitable? I mean, how much, because that is just a really interesting project that could apply to other waterfronts.
I believe that the containers that they've constructed, provide a level of protection to the plants for getting established, for getting their roots, for protecting them from wave action. And so that's, an interesting aspect to continue to follow. Other projects, planting larger and larger mangroves, trying to wedge them between the rocks of riprap. MRC has been doing these little volcanoes in concrete-covered jute to try to help hold the plant in place long enough for it to establish roots. And so it's this initial establishment time period that seems to be
It's a challenge.
the hardest. And so if this is a way to help the plants overcome that, it's an interesting step forward.
Okay, thank you.
And I think when we first saw that, I had asked Kelsey and Cook, and I had asked for them to come back with a presentation after they got a chance to get it established. Because I think it's a good option, but also it's a mangrove option where, we had the rules come out to our committee about the mangrove cutting sizes. And I think when you plant those boxes, 6 feet, I think is when you can cut them, and it comes up to about knee high. So I think that's a great option to have mangroves, but still have your view or whatever.
Right, because you're planting them at a lower level.
Yeah,
below
you're
the
planting them
seawall.
lower.
Okay, anything else? Okay, let's move on. Monthly revenue graph and financial statements, and I think, Virginia, you'll be handling that as well.
Yes, thank you. So you'll see that our revenues continue to come in more or less on track. We've collected $316 million. So the purple line are the actuals. The green line is the state projected revenues. The blue line is what we've projected as our revenues. And so right now, the purple line is between the green and the blue. We also get those quarterly distributions. And when we look at the history of those quarterly distributions, I expect our purple line to bump up next month to above our blue line. And so, if things carry on, we should be right on track or a little over our projections. Our actual collection should be just over our projections by the end of the year. Any questions about that before we move on to fiscal report? All right. Next is the monthly financial statement. And so we have $29 million assigned. So that means either our $29 million in revenues collected this year. And then we have $54.8 million assigned to projects. And of that $54.8 million assigned, $11 million has been spent. All right, moving on to the financial tables. You'll see all of the expenses per project for each of the years so far. We added the gray last quarter to show, some of these projects had a bunch of zeros, but the reason they had so many zeros was because they weren't added to the plan until year 5 or year 6. So that helps you just, guide your eyes. So you see, for the most part, projects start expending funding shortly after they are added to the plan, with some exceptions. And then that lines up with the quarterly progress report for each of the projects, which Dominic's going to go to if you're ready to move on to project progress. Okay.
So really quick, I just wanted to skim through the performance table just to show you all that the yellow boxes represent progress that we made this past quarter. With that being said, I'm going to switch to the PowerPoint. All right, so my name is Dominic. I'm an associate environmental specialist for the Sorrel program. I'll be going over the quarterly report with you guys. For public education, we have 7 projects with a budget of $3.53 million. We're about 71% complete with the fertilizer and septic maintenance campaigns. Grass clippings is at 53% complete, and the Restore Our Shores is 20% complete. They recently delivered spat for oyster gardeners, held a variety of outreach events, and built some of the oyster reefs and monitoring events. The photo shows Restore Our Shores staff spreading sea clams in 3mm nylon mesh bags, and we are working on the bids for the new campaigns, those being irrigation and stormwater best management practices. Next, we have wastewater treatment facility upgrades for reclaimed water. There are 7 projects in the plan for $27.6 million. The city of Cocoa Beach and Palm Bay were already completed, and this quarter Titusville completed their upgrades. Their facility is fully online, and they're completing the final punch list items. We had a 75th Sorrel project completion ceremony at the Osprey facility in March. The Rockledge facility is currently under construction. This quarter, they excavated the equilibrium basin slab, formed the new slab, poured the generator pad, and started sandblasting the thickener building. There are 2 wastewater treatment facility upgrade projects in the design phase. Melbourne's Grant Street Water Reclamation Facility has 100% engineering completed and is expected to go to bid in the next few months. The West Melbourne facility just completed 80% of their design. For rapid infiltration basin and spray field upgrades, we have 2 separate projects. The Long Point Park RIB upgrade was one of our first projects completed in 2017, and the Sterling House condo has not yet been contracted. There's 4 different package plant projects. Oak Point Mobile Home Park finished construction this past quarter. This connected 108 mobile homes to sewer. We have not yet contracted for Willow Lakes, the Cove, or Indian River Shores, but we're negotiating grant funding from FDEP to assist with the funds for Willow Lakes and the Cove projects. For sewer laterals, we have 6 different projects. 4 smoke testing projects were completed last summer. The funds to help residents with the repairs is underway, and so far Sorrel has assisted with 338 repairs. The Osprey Basin project is not yet contracted. You can see some photos here of repairs that were recently completed. There's the broken clay pipe with roots growing in it, and you can also see the broken PVC pipe next to it. For septic upgrades, we have a total budget of $29 million. This quarter, we had 55 septic upgrades, 4 more in Banana River, 12 in the North IRL, and 39 in Central IRL. Quick Connects have a total budget of $11.3 million, and there were 17 Quick Connects completed this quarter, 2 in the Banana River, 4 in the NIRL, and 11 in CIRL. The plan has 47 septic removal projects totaling $120 million. There are currently 9 projects under construction. Miko is under construction and 43% complete, and South Central C is at 82% completion. The Miko photo shows directional drilling along US 1, and South Central C shows the lift station and pumps to the force main. The City of Melbourne has 6 projects underway. The Satellite Beach Hedgecock-Grabowski project is 90% complete, just waiting for the final inspection. South Beach's O and P are being prepared for bid and will also begin construction soon. There are 3 completed septic to sewer projects totaling 276 connections. There are 19 septic to sewer projects in the design phase. All are at various stages, and there are 14 projects that have yet to be contracted. For stormwater, we have 240 projects in the plan. 39 have been completed, and 1 is currently under construction. This quarter, the Scottsmore Arancia project was completed. The weir causes water to back up and flow into the baffle box, and then that outflows into the field where there's band material before making its way to the lagoon. The Satellite Beach Lorry Lane project is under construction. They're replacing the trunk line with a treatment and conveyance system. We have 12 projects in the design phase, and Crane Creek is expected to begin construction this month. We also have 4 contracts circulating for review and signatures. For vegetation harvesting, there's 10 projects with a total budget of $2.2 million. The Melbourne-Tillman Water Control District project is underway. This quarter, they completed Canal 20, which removed over 800,000 pounds of vegetation with an estimated TN reduction of 4,177 pounds. Overall, this project has removed over 1 million pounds of vegetation and 13,010 pounds of total nitrogen. The plan has 20 different muck removal projects with a total budget of $160 million. Grand Canal has passed the Manatee closure date, and the DMMA site preparation is underway, and dredging is expected to resume June 15th. Last quarter, they removed 255,000 cubic yards of muck. Sykes Creek began dredging in August and has since removed over 58,200 cubic yards of material. The Oak Galley Northeast project bid has closed, and the 3 application packages are under review. 9 projects are in the design phase, and we are continuing to work with Sunnyland to get their project underway. There's 25 oyster bar projects. 8 are complete with a budget of $9.8 million. 6 projects are currently under construction. The Cocoa Beach McNabb oyster bar is attempting to catch wild spat since they're having difficulties reproducing at the aquaculture facility. The photo shows the Zoos Restore Our Shores team doing an oyster site visit. There's 11 planted shoreline projects with a budget of $130,000. McNabb did a test installation of 4 rhizolyth islands and are waiting for the oysters before full deployment. For clam aquaculture, the plan has a budget of $60,000 to support 10 clam farmers. We're currently at 4 active farmers, 1 new farmer this quarter, and searching for 6 more. So, as you can see in this overview table, as of March 2023, we had 75 projects completed with a total TN reduction of 213,120 pounds of removed a year, and a total phosphorus reduction of 13,179 pounds per year. That's an increase of 34,523 pounds per year of nitrogen and 1,179 pounds per year of phosphorus removed. And the thermometers show current completed projects. TN and TP removed or prevented in the middle, or excuse me, there's projects constructed and completed. In the middle, there's nitrogen and phosphorus removed or prevented. And then on the other side, you have trust funds collected and spent. With projects constructed and completed, you can see in the dark blue, we have 75 complete, 101 in construction. And then in the light blue, you'll see it's to 159 either underway or being constructed. In the middle, you have nitrogen and phosphorus removed or prevented. Dark blue shows the pounds of total nitrogen removed so far and pounds of total phosphorus removed so far. That's was just on the table we were looking at. You can also see that we have 977,258 pounds of total nitrogen in progress or complete. So once we've completed all the projects that are underway or constructed, that's the level of nitrogen we'll be removing per year. And same goes for that 72,037 pounds for total phosphorus. And at the top there, you can see our target of 1,309,977,000 and 106,607 for total nitrogen and total phosphorus, respectively. And then for our last one, we have the total funds collected and spent. You can see 62.4 million spent, 311.8 million collected, and 317 million underway and spent with our total target there at the top. That is the quarterly presentation.
Thank you. Any questions, Laura Lee?
Yeah, I have two questions. I'm the biggest cheerleader in the room for shoreline restoration. I mean, I'm like a broken record. However, I'm getting blasted by the fishermen, especially up in Mosquito Lagoon, which I know we're not doing. That's mostly UCF's work, but there's apparently a lot of plastic in the water that the fishermen would like to see removed, and they've asked if there is a plan to remove the plastic that's been used in the oyster restoration. The other thing is, with the seagrass restoration, the manatee cages are a hazard to navigation. These guys run the shoreline in the middle of the night in the dark, and there's got to be some method to show them where the seagrass projects are going in, so that they can get it in their brains where these projects are, so they don't hit the manatee cages in the middle of the night. So those are two concerns that I'm hearing a lot of. Thank you.
Laura Lee, you have any sense of how much, if there's plastic in the lagoon, how much of that is from the oyster bags versus all the other sources of plastic?
Well, you can see the oyster bags, and you can see those square, the original oyster mats that were plastic, and they tie wrap the oysters to those. That's what they're complaining about. And they're wondering if there is a plan to remove some of the plastic out of the restoration areas.
Thank you. Other questions?
Someone in the back has her hand up.
I think we'll,
Am I allowed to speak on that? That is my project.
hold on, no, please. I don't think in general we'll take public comment on these presentations, and we'll reserve that for public comment. So if you've got additional comment, please fill out a card, and you're welcome to make that during the public comment period. Thank you. Any other questions from the panel?
I just real quick, I just want to say, Dominic, that was a quick presentation, but there was so much work. I'm just saying, from being here throughout the years, I heard the word in construction more in that quarterly project, I think, than we've heard in a couple quarterly projects put together. So it sounds like pedals to the metal, and projects are just going. So that's awesome to hear.
Okay, thank you. And that wraps us up for, did you have?
I just want to agree with Vinny that I had the same impression. Thank you. Very good presentation. And the progress, like you said, it's starting, it's steamrolling, it's building up. I think that's one of the biggest challenges we have with the public right now is how do we effectively communicate that, right? I think, I think all the graphics are good, but I still don't think we found the silver bullet.
Okay, thank you very much. So with that, we are ready to move on to our other reports and special presentations. So our first presentation will be Stress to Marine Vertebrates from Exposure to Herbicides, Dr. Nancy Denslow.
Right, she's on Zoom and she should be sharing her screen. Good morning, Dr. Denslow.
Good
There, we
morning.
see you.
Try to. Let me share my screen here. Oop. Can you see my screen?
Yes, you're not on full screen yet. We see the sidebar.
Is
There.
this better or is this the
Yes.
wrong?
Yes, that's it. Thank you.
Okay. There's a little bit of the echo. Should I go? Thumbs up that I should go?
Yeah, you're good to go.
Okay. All right. So this presentation is titled Stress to Marine Vertebrates from Exposure to Herbicides. And the picture in this frame is of Dr. Maite de Maria, who was a graduate student in my laboratory who did all this work. So it's really her work that I'm presenting. So the first question would be, why glyphosate? So glyphosate is really a glycine molecule. Let me see if I can get my pointer to make it. Okay, hold on. Okay, well, can you see my, yeah, I guess it'll be fine. So it's a glycine molecule that you see here in the green, which is an amino acid, a building block of all proteins. So it's just an amino acid. And what they did was they added a phosphate group to it. And it was originally made as a chelator for metals. And then they found out that it was very specific for a pathway in plants that only exists in plants and not in animals, and could be used as a herbicide. But this has been used, immensely in the whole world. So it's about 6.1 billion kilograms have been used over 10 years, which is a huge amount. It's one of the top pesticides. And usually it's not measured when people do contaminant analyses because it's so polar. And most of the other methods for pesticides are for hydrophobic pesticides, and this is very hydrophilic. So it's not usually measured. And we found a paper that showed that they used a very low dose over 2 years in rats. And that low dose, which was 4 nanograms per kilogram body weight per day, caused the rats to have kidney and liver effects. And then there's a lot of literature indicating that young men that work as cane cutters in Nicaragua, in San Salvador, and in Far East have kidney disease. And they think that it might be from exposures to pesticides. This is a very unusual kidney disease that only attacks young men that otherwise are very healthy. And so we thought, well, maybe that's something that we should look at. So we didn't expect to see it in the environment because it's known to break down very quickly. And first to AMPA, and which is its first metabolite, and then to carbon dioxide and ammonia. And so we thought, okay, well, we're likely not to see it. So we got these passive samplers that are sort of illustrated at the top of this slide, where they have a sorbent that's very specific for glyphosate between these rings. And we put these out at 3 times during the year, August, September, January through February, and April through May. So this was a crazy time because we had hurricanes and other things going on all at the same time. But anyway, they were put out for about a month during those periods of time. And, for fun, we took a sample, just a grab sample when we put the posties in, and then another grab sample when we took them out. And to our dismay, we found glyphosate in all of our samples. And so this is a map, basically, of where Maite did her sampling. We were looking at Lake Okeechobee, and then at the Caloosahatchee River on one side and the St. Lucie on the other side, and then at a couple of locations within the Everglades, the Sta 1W and the Sta 2. These are regions where the water flows into the Everglades. And so what we found, or what she found, the orange, are the POCES results. Again, what we expected, because it's supposed to break down into AMPA, was that we would have a lot of AMPA if we found anything, and very little glyphosate, because it's supposed to break down. But what we found instead was that the glyphosate was very high. There was very little AMPA. And these values here at the top are the values of our GRAB samples. So the GRAB samples, the minimum we found was about 0.005 or less than that in some locations, and the max was about 4.7 micrograms per liter. And so this is just the average at these different locations. And it seemed to vary by season. And so we had thought, well, we knew that the sugarcane industry uses glyphosate right before harvest, but it's used in all kinds of agricultural events, and it's also used to spray invasive plants. And so we didn't really know what we would think or what we would find. But Maite's hypothesis was that it would probably be elevated during the spraying season for sugarcane. And as you can see here, it is in one location, but basically there's different levels at different times in the different locations. And so, okay, that's what we measured. And so I thought, well, has anybody else measured glyphosate anywhere? So we did find a report from Florida Department of Environmental Protection where they had measured glyphosate over 4 or 5 years. Now, very few measurements. So over 5 years, there are only seven measurements in the Indian River Lagoon, 11 measurements in the St. Lucie Lokahatchee region, and 18 measurements in the Lake Worth, Lagoon, Palm Beach Coast region. And one of the seven analyses had 10 micrograms per liter. 2 were between 0.7 and 0.8, and 4 analyses were really low at less than 0.1 microgram per liter. In the St. Lucie, one analysis was 10 micrograms per liter, and 5 were 0.5 to 0.9, and 5 analyses were less than 0.1. And in the Lake Worth region, with 18 measurements, 4 of those were between 4 and 7 micrograms per liter. 12 analyses were between 1 and 4 micrograms per liter, and 2 analyses were around 0.5 micrograms per liter. And so these are values that are very similar to what we found. And in fact, we've done additional work since where we found it in the Everglades itself. So this is work that I'm collaborating with someone else on, and so I don't have those values with me right now. But it's there. Okay, so the next question is, why manatees? Well, manatees are wonderful. They're a marine mammal. They're endangered. They're threatened. They're known to have a mutation in a PON1 gene. So this mutation makes them more susceptible to oxidative stress and more susceptible to contaminants. And they're also susceptible, as everyone knows, to other insults like red tide and boat strikes. And glyphosate may impact their immune systems and their kidney function, was our hypothesis. So what Maite did, not knowing whether we would find it or not, she had access to 106 different manatee plasma samples that had been collected over the years by different groups. And so we have a method where we can measure glyphosate in plasma. And so without requiring very much plasma, we were able to measure it. And 55.8% of the manatees that she tested had glyphosate in their plasma. And if you look over the years, it seems like the manatees that were sampled in later years have slightly higher amounts of glyphosate. There's a trend up versus some of the manatees that we got that were collected, samples from manatees collected from the St. Johns River, where there seems to be a trend down. We only have a few samples from about 2017 to 2019, and there seems to be a trend down. So what do we know about glyphosate? We know that within this period of time, there's been a 15-fold increase in the use of glyphosate for agricultural and non-agricultural purposes. It still keeps going up. But in the St. Johns River, they stopped using glyphosate. And so I thought, wow, this might be a trend showing that if you just stop using it, the values will go down. So, but anyway, this is our data. It's a very short period of time, and these are just trends, and so we don't really know more than that about it. Crystal River is this blue line here, and the amounts in the Crystal River manatees also are trending up, but they're much less than they are, say, in the Brevard County. Okay, so what are some of the possible off-target reactions of glyphosate? So one of the things we thought about was that what glyphosate does in plants is to disrupt this biochemical pathway that produces essential amino acids for plants. Now, this pathway is only present in plants because for humans or manatees, we have to get those amino acids from our diet. We don't make them in our body. So we have to get, those are the essential amino acids we have to obtain from our diet. So that pathway doesn't exist in humans or mammals of any sort. But because we thought it was a potential immunosuppressant, we thought, well, maybe what we could do is we could get the blood cells, the white blood cells, from the plasma samples that we had and look to see how well they proliferate when they respond to a mitogen. So a white blood cell should proliferate. That's what they do. They take, a mitogen is like a bacteria or something, and so the white blood cells engulf it and proliferate and eat it up. So proliferation is a good thing for the response to a mitogen. So we tested that possibility for these blood samples. And what we found was that in vitro, so this is in the laboratory, we could separate these blood cells and put them in culture. If we added different amounts of glyphosate, again, 10 micrograms, 1,000 micrograms, or 10 milligrams, so these are really high values, but you could see a trend towards reduction of the proliferation ability of the white blood cells. So just to note, the EPA has allowed 700 micrograms. I can't get this. Let me see if I can get this out. 700 micrograms per liter in drinking water. So that's okay. Well, 700 micrograms per liter is around our medium dose, a little bit lower than that. And we could consider like a 10 milligram per liter concentration, something that would happen if you contaminated a site. But anyway, what we found, these short-term in vitro assays, acute assays, was that there was a dose-responsive effect, and it seemed like there was about a 27% reduction in the proliferation. So what does this mean? Well, it's an immune response. Glyphosate's not killing the manatees. It's not something that's responsible for all the deaths of the manatees in the Indian River Lagoon. But these manatees are, exposed to red tide, to cold stress, to watercraft injuries. And now there's another thing, glyphosate. And one of my colleagues has measured perfluorinated. Those are the forever chemicals in manatees. And they're there. And there's probably other things there as well. And so it's just one more insult. Okay, so we've also done some plant studies. One of our colleagues brought us plants from St. Joe Bay in Florida, and these were supposed to be control plants, and we were going to use them just as a way to figure out how to extract glyphosate from plants. We were going to spike the plants and see if we could get our methods to work. And what we found is that they were in those plants. Okay, so about seagrasses, they grow along a rhizome. So the rhizome has the little growing centers for each plant, and those are the centers that are the most responsive, and then the roots that they set up. And so in these plants from St. Joe was Thalassa, we looked at the blades, the rhizomes, and the roots. And we found concentrations about 1.5 in the blades. Again, glyphosate was more prominent. The AMPA was not really measurable in those. We could see a little peak of it, but it was below our quantitation, so we couldn't give you a value there. But you could see that it's quite present in the blades, quite present in the rhizomes, and quite present in the roots. And these are two different plants. And so we thought maybe we should check that and try in our own lab to see what would happen. So we put, this is a Vallisneria growing in our lab, and we have control, 0.05 mg per liter, 0.5 mg per liter, and 10 mg per liter. There was no effect. It didn't kill the plants. There was no effect really on growth. But what we noted, I've sort of enlarged this, was that the root structure was quite different. So you could see the roots of the control are pretty well there. There's a lot of root structure. We had them growing in little baskets. So it's a little bit hard to pull them out of the baskets. And the 0.05 still has quite a bit of the root structure. There's a little bit less than the 0.5. And wow, the 10 milligram per liter concentration seems to have taken away all these little side roots. They were really easy to pull out. And we're going to collaborate with a colleague who's going to let us use a machine that will allow us to test for the amount of force required to pull them out of the basket. So we got that to do. But this is a 21-day exposure. Again, 21 days is not a lifetime. And so the other thing we need to do is very low concentrations, as we're finding out there, and see if, say, over a year or 6 months, how do the roots look. And we haven't done our biochemical studies yet on these. We're wanting to look to see if it's affected the nutritional quality of the Vallisneria. But that's where we are. We did measure the glyphosate within the leaves so far, and you could see that the leaves have glyphosate. They seem to accumulate it, and it's sort of a dose response. And we thought, oh, wow, this was 10 micrograms. So we used rodeo, which is a commercial application where that's about 50% glyphosate. So the 10 milligrams, the 10 here, refers to the amount of glyphosate in that amount of rodeo that we use. And so it seemed like the glyphosate was lower. But if you look over here at the AMPA, so the scales are a little bit different. But this is this one is about 25 nanograms per milligram plant, the rodeo at the 0.5, and this one goes down to 10. But if you look on this scale here, the AMPA, the only one that had AMPA was the highest concentration, and it's almost 10. So this plus this, it looks like it would be additive, so it's about leveling off. But it seems like some enzyme or something has been turned on to degrade the glyphosate in the plants that have had the highest concentration. And there's this idea that plants might have a defense zone. So when they start feeling something is aggravating them or it's stressful, they can turn on genes that would do something, and possibly that's what's happening here. But we still have to check that out. Okay, so I think in conclusion, there's a lot of research needs. We need more frequent monitoring for glyphosate and other herbicides and pesticides. We need to do additional experiments with seagrasses to examine their resilience, their growth, their nutritional value. And we have some of those experiments that are ongoing. And we also need to better understand how these interactions work between nitrogen, phosphorus, agricultural pesticides and pharmaceuticals, because there's going to be pharmaceuticals in these waters as well. And like, for example, it might be that glyphosate is not breaking down into AMPA because of the high phosphorus, because it has a phosphorus on it. And so the bacteria could use the phosphorus from the water instead of from the glyphosate, and maybe that's why it's not breaking down. And we're seeing only glyphosate in the environment. But anyway, that's where we are, and I wanted to acknowledge our collaborators. Like I mentioned first, this is the work of Maite de Maria. Dr. Mike Walsh was also a co-supervisor of Maite's research project. Kevin Kroll is in my laboratory, Laurie Adler, who helped us obtain the samples, and the sampling tent, the Florida Fish and Wildlife, and the USGS Sirenia project, because without these people, these samples, we would never have access to them. And so we're so thankful and grateful for what they've been able to, help us with. And with that, I would be happy to take questions.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. Any questions from the committee? Yep.
I don't know if you've done any research to look into this, but are you noticing any sort of presence of the glyphosate in like muck or something? Would your testing of the water give you any indication as to what might be in the muck as well?
I think that's a great place it might be. Yeah, we haven't tested.
Okay, others? Okay, thank you very much for your time and the presentation. And with that, we will move on to our next presentation, which is Manatee Health Investigations in the Indian River Lagoon. Martine DeWitt.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. Let me share my screen. Can you see the main slideshow right now?
Yes.
Okay, I will proceed. Is it possible to put the room on mute? Because yeah, thank you so much. So I'm Martine de Wit. I'm with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, and I'm talking to you from our main manatee lab in St. Pete. The FWC covers the whole state of Florida for manatees, and we get reports on sick, distressed, or dead manatees through our Wildlife Alert hotline. It's a 24/7 number that people in Florida can call, and that's how we learn about manatees that we need to respond to. And we have 5 field stations across Florida to cover all that. So we are the front line for manatee health issues, one through our necropsy program of manatee carcasses that we use to monitor manatee health, identify possible management issues, investigate unusual mortality events. We are also strongly connected to live manatees through the rescue program in collaboration with the Manatee Rehabilitation Partnership, all the facilities that take care of the manatees in rehab. And then we also have connections to the wild manatees that are supposed to be healthy through studies like telemetry, where when we capture these animals, they will get a full health assessment, and that's where some of the samples came from that Dr. Denslow just talked about. So manatees in the Indian River Lagoon, there are 2 main attractions here for manatees. One is warm water, and 2 is food. There's a seasonal movement of manatees in and out of the Indian River Lagoon all along the Atlantic coast, and it used and it's still a very popular spot, like a central hub for manatees on the Atlantic coast. Even when manatees do not use it for warm water in the winter, there used to be such an abundance of food, and manatees are herbivores, and they eat about 7% of their body weight per day, and there used to be an abundance of that. Just to give you a bit of an idea on how these manatee movements work in and out of the Indian River Lagoon, on the right we have a telemetry track of a manatee that receives this responder in the Indian River Lagoon in the winter. And you see the red dots following the manatee's movement once temperatures warmed up. And this manatee then went all the way north using North Florida. And there are a lot of manatees that even go further north from that. So that's a manatee that uses the Indian River Lagoon for warm water in the winter, but then spreads out. And the other example of a manatee is in that smaller figure that you see to the left of here, where the manatee uses South Florida for warm water in the winter, but then when temperatures warm up, moves north and spends most of its time in the Indian River Lagoon. So these are animals that use mosquito and, before other areas, and spend most of their year in the Indian River Lagoon. So this just shows you what a hotspot it is for manatees on the Atlantic coast, but also shows that there's no such thing as a real Indian River Lagoon manatee. A lot of manatees just move in and out depending on the season. So we have long known that there are main threats to manatees like watercraft collisions and the loss of warm water habitat. These are described in a threats analysis by Runch et al. And this is statewide, but a main problem in the Indian River Lagoon. For the loss of warm water habitat, manatees are susceptible to cold, and in the picture on the bottom right, you see a manatee with cold stress that develops when manatees are exposed to when temperatures drop into the 60s, so that's basically every winter, and they can develop what we call Florida frostbite. So for that, manatees need to stay warm, and one of the main warm water sites in the Indian River Lagoon is the FP&L plant at Cape Canaveral, but there are also secondary sites in the IRL that manatees use to overwinter. So we need these warm water sites. Loss of warm water habitat is a threat to manatees, but even if the warm water functions, there have been a couple of record cold winters, the winters of 2010, where the temperatures were so low, freezing, that even the warm water was not enough, and we had major mass mortality of manatees related to this record cold. Right after these cold events in 2010, the super blooms and the loss of seagrass came into play in the Indian River Lagoon, and all of you are familiar with that. And manatees initially adapted to that loss of seagrass by just changing their diet. At the time, there were macroalgae that took over instead of the seagrass at the surface, and manatees started eating those macroalgae. So initially, they did not go hungry, but this did reveal a new threat to manatees. And it caused mass mortality in 2013. So what happened here? This diet change from seagrass to macroalgae, which has less fiber, caused a gut upset. And here we have normal gut flora, Clostridium, that are normally present in manatees' guts, that now get a perfect storm to develop toxins. And this is a very acute process. And so these Clostridia develop toxins that can cause a manatee to die, within hours. And the picture that you see on the bottom right shows a cross-section of the manatee's gut. where this toxin starts to blister the intestine, and you see all that pink red color, which is a stain, immunohistological stain for the toxin of Clostridium difficile A. We documented at least 199 manatees deaths in the Indian River Lagoon from this disease between 2012 and 2019 when we were investigating this mortality event. Then found it's not really unique. It occurs in other places in Florida too if manatees change their diet. But because macroalgae were everywhere, this turned into a mass event. So again, important to remember this was a very acute disease and manatees were in good body condition. And we saw manatee mortalities go down from this after 2013. So it's also possible, like described in other species, that you can adapt to this new diet, which likely happened in manatee. Now, moving on, like a few years down the road, the macroalgae disappeared as well, and there was very little vegetation left in the Indian River Lagoon. And here we have our next threat to manatees that was recognized in December 2020. The Atlantic coast mortality event from chronic malnutrition and starvation. These manatees were severely emaciated. The body condition indices show these animals were up to 40% underweight. Externally, you see on the right a manatee that's normal. On the left a manatee that's normal. On the left, these flattened manatees with a dip in their dorsal neckline, which is what we call the peanut head. Internally, they lost fat, muscle condition, and this atrophy was even seen in their major organs, like the liver, their heart, and the muscle of their diaphragm. And the picture on the top right shows you the normal fat and muscle that should be, muscle should be nice, solid and red, pinkish. And then on the right, you see that fat and muscle basically dissolve into water, what we call the serous atrophy. So this is a very prolonged process. This does not happen overnight. So these animals probably experience the problems with this nutrition way before December 2020, and it just built up and suddenly became evident. We also found that manatees, I'll show you in the next slide, this is mostly peaking in winter, but even manatees that survived winter and then swam out and reached areas where they could eat further north, they were still too weak to recover. So despite the fact that they started eating again, this condition could not be reversed. So here's an overview of the weekly mortality numbers from the whole Atlantic coast. Brings me back to what I mentioned before, is Indian River Lagoon is central. A manatee that cannot find enough forage in the Indian River Lagoon during summertime and then migrate south can succumb due to the chronic malnutrition in other areas on the Atlantic coast. So we have the weekly mortality numbers here in the bars against the black baseline, what we expect for mortality during those weeks. And you see in the first 2 years, December 2020 is when we start, and also the year after that, the numbers were above baseline and really peaked during the winter time. Does not mean that these animals recovered during the summer. It's just going back to what we discussed before, is that stress of colder temperatures is what just pushes these animals over the edge when they're already in poor body conditions from not having enough muscle condition, body fat, and then they have to try to survive the winter, and that's just, they just do not have enough resilience to do that. So that's why we see the peaks of this event during the winter time. And then over the summer, it is mostly at baseline, but reports from the field during that first summer and even last summer, there were many anecdotal reports of manatees in thin conditions seen over the summer, but they were able to deal with it because it was warm enough. Now, good news from this past winter, you see that the mortalities were at or even below baseline for most of the winter. Because the mortality numbers were so high, you saw in the previous slide where, last month, 1,300 something carcasses. They're too many for us to necropsy. It's also not necessary. We want to focus on detailed health examination with sample collection that really informs us on the state of these animals. So for that, we target good carcasses for necropsy. And then for the others that did not receive a full necropsy, and that's abbreviated here as VNN, verified not necropsy. So this figure here starts the winter of 2021, 2022, where you see the numbers up in the winter. And if we look at all the colors other than the blue, you see the green. Primary starvation is the leading cause of death during the winter. For those carcasses that did not receive a full necropsy, so we do not know if they could have died from watercraft, we did do partial examinations to look for those signs of chronic malnutrition and starvation in their body tissues. Look at depleted fat, that watery consistency, and we also saw that in the majority of those carcasses. So, obviously this was the leading cause of mortality during the winter. And then you see during the summer, the leading cause of death turns into the usual threats like watercraft. But this past winter, you see the total numbers staying low, and the number of primary starvation, the portion of primary starvation, we've seen a couple of cases, but it is so much lower than the year before. So why is that? I'm not going to steal Lori Morris's slide here. She has this excellent slide showing all the transect work that they do. And it did show some recovery in the Mosquito Lagoon last year. So it appears that is really one of the answers why manatees were able to make a comeback. Mosquito Lagoon, we saw manatee movement there over recent years where there's not much in the rest of the IRL. Mosquito Lagoon held up for a long period of time. So that's where manatees spent their summers. And then in 2020, when that finally fell, that's when we had our mortality event because manatees just did not get enough food that summer. And then last summer, these were the observations from the field. Seagrass and manatee fecals that are in, expected shape and quantity. So this told us that manatees are here in the Mosquito Lagoon. There are some seagrass. They're producing fecals. So there must be a reason why. At one point, I think it was about 1,000 animals were there, and that's then turned into this winter. Where animals were in much better condition. So that answer was there in the summer. Now, I wanted to pose this question. Manatees have received so much attention over the past few years. Are they really the 1,000-pound canary for the Indian River Lagoon? There are a couple of considerations here. Like we've known for, almost over a decade, that the health of the Indian River Lagoon for seagrasses was extremely poor. And manatees were very late as a symptom of all of this. Almost everyone had left, and then we had this chronic starvation event. So They were not the first indicator of the poor health of the system, just looking at mortality. There are other considerations with manatees. They always have this image of being resilient. We do not see much of viral disease or other natural infections in manatees. Like, we searched for avian influenza when that was a problem in the past few winters, where there were actually influenza cases of birds right there with manatees. Could not find the virus in manatees. Same for COVID. So, they may not be the best indicators for certain health issues. If there's an acute disease, such as the Clostridium, then yes. But otherwise, also because what I mentioned, this movement all along the Atlantic coast, if you have a manatee that dies, it's like we saw in South Florida with the high mortality, it does not mean that the original problem was in South Florida. It was in the Indian River Lagoon. And same thing with what we do with watercraft necropsies. If we see chronic watercraft in a manatee in Brevard County, it doesn't mean that the animal was injured in Brevard County. It could have received that injury up north or further south. So those are all considerations in our health investigations to really connect manatees to the environment. So with that, I am going to conclude my slides.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Questions from the committee? Terry?
Thank you. Great presentation. So in the context of these unusual mortality events over the last, 7, 8 years, or maybe 10, what's the history of manatee populations? And specifically, did we see a growth or a surge in total population prior to, say, 2010, 2011, or not?
Yes. The question is always how do you count the populations, and those methods have developed over the years as well. Like, if you look before 2010, the models that were used at that time were different than they are now. The way that we are flying abundance surveys right now has only been done, I think, for the past 10 years. So, to really compare that, I'm not comfortable to make statements on that. Also, I'm not the population expert. But I think everyone is consensus that the population has grown since, over the past decade, since the 70s, since we really started studying manatees. And before there were like the synoptic surveys where you basically count manatee heads during certain times of the year to get a minimal estimate of how many manatees there are. Those are, people have compared it to watching a popcorn pop. So it really depends on the conditions. But, over the years, manatee numbers have increased in that. And we've also seen it in our mortality numbers. Obviously, you have these mortality events that can be catastrophic, but if you look at the general mortality trends, they have gone up, which is assumed to be from growing population.
Okay. Others?
Have there been any studies on the migration of the manatees? In other words, I've lived on the Indian River Lagoon for a little more than 30 years, and I've not done any scientific study, but I have eyes and I see trends. And it used to be that if you saw a manatee in October, November, or December, it was always heading south. I don't see that anymore. I see an awful lot of manatees that are just stay throughout the winter. And so I see that as a non-scientist as a twofold problem. One, they're not getting to warmer weather, so they're more susceptible to cold. And two, if the population remains large and the food source is small, you have a double whammy there.
Yeah, there have been studies on manatee migration, like those telemetry studies that I had at the beginning of the slides. Those are smaller sample sizes of manatees that were followed during the winter. At the moment, we also try to have manatees tagged year-round to investigate their response to this loss of seagrass and see where they go. There are manatees tagged further north in Georgia. So there's a lot of work going on there. I think it's too early to really draw big picture conclusions. Have their migration pattern changed altogether? They do still come to their warm water sites during the winter. Only if you have milder winters, they do not have to stay there like for days in a row, for weeks in a row. So that's maybe why you see that, some manatees venture out on those warmer days. And if you have a mild winter, some manatees may not go further south, but they stay in Brevard County because they just do not get that cold trigger. As far as, the number, are we at capacity? That's basically the second part of your question, right? Like, are there too manatees and they have basically destroyed their own food source? That's a very, complex issue. As far as the capacity of manatees from, and again, I'm not the spokesperson or expert on that, but we did not come to capacity just yet. And it's unfortunately a double whammy where you have this environmental disaster, that's so complex and involves water quality, where manatees are just a symptom. But they've always lived in harmony with the lush seagrass in Brevard County and in the River Lagoon, and they are not the cause of the problem.
Okay, thanks. Other questions? Oh, right here, Bob.
Yeah, I was just curious if maybe there's like comparison studies or being looked at with, so I guess, so the Indian River Lagoon is obviously a major impact for the East Coast population, right? Going from Georgia to maybe probably into the Caribbean. What about the West Coast of the state? Is there any similar studies being done or maybe impacts already noticed in those populations? And would they come around the coast as much, or do they stay more on the Gulf side?
We've always considered for management these to be two different subpopulations, and actually on the Gulf Coast you have the Northwest population and the Southwest population. Northwest basically starting Crystal River and then going into the Panhandle. Southwest is here Tampa Bay all the way down to the Everglades. And occasionally there are anecdotes of manatees switching from coast to coast. Whether that's going to be a trend where manatees are fleeing the sinking ship, if you will, and moving to another coast, that's too early to tell. I doubt that will happen, but they adapt, so they may first use other areas on the Atlantic coast before going west. As far as similar issues like not enough forage, the warm water issues, they're different on the Gulf Coast. Manatees behave differently on the Gulf Coast too. They are not as migrational along the whole coast like on the Atlantic. The manatees from the Northwest subpopulation will really stick to that region, same as Southwest usually. But they, like Southwest, has their own issue with red tide, which is also, I did not cover that in here, but that's another main threat that we recognize for the population as a whole long term.
Okay, thank you. Others? Charlie?
Yeah, again, enjoyed the conversation, and I wanted to follow up. Kurt had mentioned about basically carrying capacity. So it's really important to understand that all species are subject to limitations in the environment based on food, how much waste is produced, and a whole sort of variables. So every year it fluctuates every year. So there's some years the carrying capacity is greater, some years it's less. When you don't have any seagrass, the carrying capacity pretty much plummets for at least the manatee species. So it is a complex issue, and it's great the research that you're doing to help us maybe better understand this problem.
Okay, thank you. Others? Vinny?
Thank you very much. And I know you said that the other questions were complicated, and this one I tried to be even more complicated. So we'll see how this goes. No, I'm kidding. But so in the investigations, you talked about thermal discharges. Has there been any investigations to see once a thermal discharge is removed, how the manatee population survives and where they go? I'm just trying to think in our plan, well, in 50 years from now, once we have seagrass everywhere in the lagoon, and they're able to thrive and strive, if we were to remove, the warm water discharges that we have, has there been any investigations about manatee populations after a thermal discharge has been removed?
Yeah, this happened, I believe it was back in the 80s. When there was a relatively small plant, I would have said, well, small as considered used by manatees up in, I think it was north from Jacksonville in Fernandina. And that plant shut down, and the manatees who were used to go to that power plant, they just waited for the warm water to turn on. And maybe at the time it was different, where you do not have all the migration patterns like we have now. And this was a group of manatees that, was so loyal to their warm water site. They learned that from their moms and their calves, and they will go there every single winter. And, they just got trapped and could not go anywhere. So, yeah, that is a concern with, now you have these major power plants, like FPNL, where the majority of manatees on the Atlantic coast can be found there during peak time in the winter. And if that shuts down, what are you going to do? So I'm not in management, that's not my thing, but, it's a real concern and something that people plan for and, hope to find some long-term solutions. But it's not as easy as you pick up the manatees and move them somewhere else, because they will go back to that same spot where they learn to stay warm the winter after, or, even later that same winter.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I didn't know that there was one in Fernandina Beach. That's interesting to see what they did in the 80s and to have the science based on it. But thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bobby?
Oh, one more quick. Maybe kind of getting off of the seagrass a little bit. Did you notice any difference in population areas where they still have an abundance of shoreline vegetation? Just because I do remember growing up here, and we were on the lagoon and the creeks and the canals and the islands and both sides of the lagoon a lot. We did see that. We did see the manatees, and there was a lot more seagrass. Like, we would snorkel the lagoon and find seahorses every weekend. And just wondering if you might have noticed any factors in that comparison maybe, or if you didn't think to do the comparison with that yet, or, yeah, or if that's just...
Yeah, and we have not done like a evidence-based study to give you a good answer here. But, again, from anecdotal reports that we get through our wildlife alert hotline, I remember it was, maybe a few years before the big mortality started in 2020, that could have been an early indicator where you see manatees crawling up on people's lawns in a high water event to get to that seagrass. It may also be because, it's just something different besides the usual, and they like the taste. But yeah, shoreline vegetation is definitely a resource. I don't think it's enough to sustain certain manatees, but the ones who survived were inventive, and they got their resources somewhere. So shoreline was probably part of whatever they could find.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. Oh, one last question then.
Thanks for having me.
Oh,
Well,
wait.
I have a comment. I don't have a question. To your point, I see over the last couple of years, many manatees. I'm fortunate enough to live on a coquina ridge, so my shoreline is all coquina rock, and it has a lot of algae growing on it. And I understand that algae is a very poor nutritional source for manatees. So keeping that in mind, it's heartbreaking when I see the manatees trying to get at that algae because they can't climb on rocks, they can't crawl up the side of the rocks, and they're trying to eat that algae, obviously, because they're hungry and they don't have a regular food source. You say they're very adaptive, and I think that that's pretty well accepted. So when do they start moving someplace else to try and find grasses? Hopefully down south would be the logical, we would think that anyway, but I don't know where the grasses are, if there are any. But we obviously have an awful lot more manatees now than we did 15, 20 years ago. So there's not enough food source for all the manatees. So I guess my question is, when do they start to adapt and start moving?
Yeah, I can answer really briefly. They already adapted, and some did not make it. That's why we went through this unprecedented mortality event. But I am hopeful, and there are positive signs that the Indian River Lagoon is coming back. So there's a place for everyone in the IRL, which includes manatees, I hope.
Okay, thank you very much.
And I wanted to thank you also because you've been very informative.
So I will ask the committee now, would you like to take a break now or go through the next presentation and then take a few-minute break? Any preferences? Charge on. I concur. Okay, let's move on then to implications of seagrass changes on manatee distribution in the Indian River Lagoon waters surrounding NASA's Kennedy Space Center. Doug Scheit.
Shut this off. I'm just trying to get this off for you. What's that?
It's the high flow controls.
Oh, yeah, that's obvious. Okay. Use this.
Okay. Good morning. A little background. Starting with the early 1970s, there's been an interest in manatee distribution in the whole Indian River Lagoon, and aerial surveys were started in the late 70s, and then starting in the early 80s, as part of the long-term ecological monitoring stuff at the Kennedy Space Center, there was more interest in what was occurring, mainly in the northern Banana River, even though the Space Center's footprint runs all the way up through Mosquito Lagoon, because that would be the greatest actions of moving equipment and stuff through Banana River for space operations. So we started a long-term monitoring program up there. So one of the big questions is what was happening for that over time. And at the same time, again, was just talked about in a previous presentation very well, was the most common use patterns of manatees are the greatest dispersion is in the summer. They move to the furthest northern and southern extent, and then they contract back down as the temperature comes back, and they stop in the Indian River Lagoon, and mainly in the northern portion of the lagoon, which is pretty much from here north, so it's kind of stopover like a Stuckey's, or I guess now Bucky's or whatever, but it's the same thing, they stop. But they've been a high use area, especially in these areas, and not to say the whole, they also on all lagoon, but we know information like that. So what we've been looking through aerial surveys over time, again, there's some early surveys started in the early 70s, but really started in earnest in 1984. The yellow line is the mean percent cover of seagrass in the portion of the Banana River, the Space Center, basically from the port to the pads. And these are our transects which monitor the relative percent cover within these seagrass beds through time. And the district then started in the 90s, the total width of those and following those same things. So it kind of follows the same trends. If you follow that, it was fairly, there's annual variation as in any kind of system, but you can see it was relatively healthy and stayed in 30–40% cover. Now, that doesn't mean that's basically the density of that grass at the time, but the widths of those beds stayed fairly wide all the way up until we started seeing the impact of these large algal blooms, and then the system really just went down really quickly. And at the same time, we knew that since the manatees during the summer, they expanded during the summer, so the greatest dispersion was there, and there's less noise in our signal for looking at manatees. We know they occurred there all year round, but by that time, they kind of went where they're going to stay for the summer. So you kind of have your season ticket holders for that portion of the thing. Though not saying the animals don't move, but they move in a relatively smaller scale at that time. And so we flew aerial surveys, and we would try to fly twice a month during our summer months. We did stuff around the rest of the year, but though there's less noise in our signal from what we're looking at. So over time, you can see the bars here, the blue bars show the mean number of animals we observe per flight during each year for the summer periods. And you can see there's been a large increase in the thing. And again, this is relative abundance. This isn't population because there's a whole lot more complication involved in that. But what we're seeing out of this is really what's saying is what the piece of pie of the population is for that year were occurring during the summer in the Banana River. And that can change, the importance of it change over time too, because as the numbers may expand and contract overall, that would make this more important or less of a proportion of that. So we see it over time. So we can just see over this period of time, relative to the 2000s and stuff, relatively stable numbers, especially from like 2005, 2009, 10. And that's when really we see, prior to that, seagrasses were relatively healthy within the whole lagoon, especially in that area. And then we started seeing these large bloom events, and that's when we got these massive crashes quickly. And what we saw during the same time is larger numbers or proportion of animals coming into our area. So we're seeing where these animals are coming from other areas, so it doesn't mean they're coming from further south or north, and we're not sure, but we know that they're coming from somewhere else because prior to that, the population was relatively, I won't say stable, but the numbers were relatively, there's not large changes every year over time. So that means they're coming from somewhere else, so we wanted to look at that information. So that's what we saw through this question here. So this gives you a little better spatial idea of the same thing we're seeing. And each one of these panels shows, the green cover on each one of these panels shows the extent of seagrass during that time. Those are from the St. John's maps that we've been using through lagoon-wide for a ton over the years. So you can see in each panel, that's the extent of the distribution of seagrass for those years. The red dots are sightings for animals during the surveys during this period, during the summertime, and the relative size is the relative size of the sightings. So really small dots are usually 1 or 2 individuals. Larger dots can indicate up to 20 to 60 animals in a smaller area. So we can show this not only temporally, we're looking at time, and those bars showed us the relative numbers overall for the survey. This kind of shows us where they are spatially when we flew over that area. So it's a snapshot of where we saw them during time. And you can see when resources were really abundant, there's larger aggregation areas, but they're kind of more spread out. As time went, you can see too, the mean number of animals was 262 per flight. That's pre-bloom, seagrass crash, et cetera. 2017, that's very much post. You can see the drastic reduction in available seagrass into the whole area. And also, there's a large increase in the numbers. And we saw those spikes in both of those. So we can see where they came in. And you can see, too, the distribution of those animals during that time have gone more towards the shoreline, which are basically shallower because kind of the implication is shallow in the shore and lagoon, very slowly slopes, and there's like a little basin, and there's the ICW that runs through this. So depth and seagrass distribution, it shows that, especially during these bloom events, the depth of occurrence of seagrass slowly receded quickly, or sometimes completely. At the same time, they're moving it. So we also kind of see, too, is the animals are moving to more shallow water also. And then by 2019, you can see there's a tenfold decrease, in manatees in the same area. So we're going from 380 per flight in 2017 to mere 38 animals. And you can also see, too, how much seagrass was lost. We lost over 95% of the seagrass from the port to the pad. That's roughly 12,000 acres between that time. And put that in a better perspective, you know, an acre of seagrass, an acre is roughly from the goal line to about the 10-yard line of a football field, so 11,000 and change. Or put it in a different perspective, if you took 12,000 acres of seagrass and you ripped them up into 36-foot wide strips, which is the width of I-95, you start laying those end to end. When you got to Jacksonville, if you turned left and kept doing that, you would stop in Los Angeles. That's how much seagrass was just lost in this area. So, and that's a number I've tried to wrap my head around many, many times, but spatially that gives you how much impact we've lost that quickly because of the bloom events. So the big question then is, we were just looking at the portion of Banana River, but we were working in a vacuum. We know that, as was illustrated from the other stuff there, that those during the summer, they're all within the lagoon, but we know over time, this is how much we're seeing our piece of pie, but then we weren't seeing them. So in starting about 2015, we were seeing our grass decline, but we also knew Mosquito Lagoon, because we were also tracking seagrass up there, we could know that still the numbers relatively stable, and we knew manatees used that area, but that wasn't our direct area of focus, but we had done some research up there in concert with a few other groups looking at distribution, and the density always in that area has been lower than what we were seeing on our flights during this time, but we know that it was happening. So the next question is, where are all the manatees going, or the ones we're seeing, because our pies numbers have shifted. So if we look at this middle graph right here, starting in late 2015, this is the summer numbers, but during this time we're starting to get anecdotal information that we're seeing more manatees occurring up in the Mosquito Lagoon area. So we expanded our survey areas starting in late 15, early 16, but we started looking at the numbers. Now we can see comparisons. Again, those yellow bars are the mean percent cover of seagrass in the Banana River. The red dots are the transects that we had up in Mosquito Lagoon, mostly in the southern portion, but these trends pretty much follow the same with the seagrass maps that the Water Management District has, et cetera, and actually some of their transects in Banana River are part of the same data set. So we started doing our surveys, and you can see over time, 2016, our numbers, you know, the previous year we're seeing over 500 animals. The next year we're down to 150 animals. And then, but at the same time, we really didn't have a baseline, a firm baseline from previous years, but we know from other studies that this probably is a large number. And then we're seeing a large proportion of animals also occurring in Mosquito Lagoon over time. And then the next year, 2017, grass is kind of still crashed in Banana River, but still, stable in Mosquito Lagoon. And we see some of those animals come back, but we still see a large number of animals still in Mosquito Lagoon. And by 2018-19, our numbers in Banana River have almost gone to like 38 per flight to hundreds, or not 700-800 animals in Mosquito Lagoon. And in 2020, we did new surveys because of other implications from COVID. But 2021 and 22, we started surveys again. We could still see that there's underutilization of Banana River at this time and a large shift of animals to Mosquito Lagoon, and that was been seen in, you know, the previous talks talked about that also. And just to show that on a spatial scale, on the left is 2017. It's the same map we kind of saw before, but we expanded up there, so the same thing is green seagrass. Size of the red dots is the size of the the sightings between 2017 and 2022. You can see that 2017 numbers are relatively equal, or there's the same amount, and by 2022 you can see this massive shift up there. So those are the kind of the trends we've been seeing up in that area. And just more currently, we flew yesterday, did the same survey. We saw between here and here, we saw more animals come back, but this is very, anecdotally, because it's only one data point out of the year, but we're seeing more animals back. We saw like 200 animals in Banana River portion, where previous to that we were seeing a lot less numbers, and there was over 620 in our portion of the Mosquito Lagoon. And the state's been flying the whole lagoon on a more regular basis, and they overfly all these same areas. And within the past couple of weeks, they saw roughly 1,600 animals. So if you look at that, 50% of the manatees in the whole lagoon, that's from Jupiter to ponds, are occurring up in this area. And like it was mentioned before, there's 50 to 70% of the East Coast population is usually Brevard-centric over time anyway. So those are the current trends that we've been seeing in our area. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, rush questions, hold on. Okay, so let's start with Terry.
Thank you, great presentation. What struck me, if you go back to that chart that showed your transepts, back a couple more from that one. So we had the big bloom 2011 and seagrass plummeted, and then it recovered, right?
Right.
So 2013, 2014, 2015. Now we got this drop, and it's not recovering, right? We've talked about this before. This is, I think, one of the things that we should be tackling, right? What's going on that we're not getting recovery of seagrass in the southern part of the lagoon?
I mean, people have been trying to still investigate that, and actually, this year still, when we fly, we kind of have an index of what we see in the bottom, kind of look at that, but just kind of just as a note there. But also, seagrass researchers up and down the lagoon, and ourselves, including ourselves, most of the transect data is either collected in the dead of winter for the low value, and then again later in the summer. But since there's more interest in seagrass right now, people are sending more eyes in the lagoon, and we're seeing more SAV, and that covers everything from drift algae to Clerpa, which is really a common attached macroalgae, and it's there fairly abundantly in areas. So when people look in the water, they see a footprint of something, but there's more Clerpa right now. But it's encouragingly, there's more Rupia and Halidulia, which are two of the seagrasses that were dominant there. It's in still very low numbers, but again, it's early in the growing season. We're in early May, so there are some shoots coming back and forth in areas, but at the extent that back to those pre-bloom conditions, I think that's a long haul. And there's a lot of work being done on that, especially through like the NEP group and along those groups, and along with Brevard County doing work.
Terry, because there's a lot of ecologists and doctors talking, I'm just going to talk now too, because I'm neither of those. But I just think that that's a system crash, and I think it bounced. And so I think it hit hard, but the system, again, tried to. And because there was so much bad stuff in the lagoon, it got up a little bit, and then it just went down and stayed down. That's just been my perception in talking to different scientists, is that it's such a big system, it's not going to crash and stay down forever. It's going to bounce and then go down.
Yeah, and part of that, too, is the water cleared and the bloom after a while left. It was more persistent, especially in the epicenter. A lot of that was in the northern Banana River, that area. So one year it crashed, shaded stuff out, but there still were some available below ground biomass shoots and stuff. So the water cleared up some, it grew again, but then these came back, and then it had, after 1 or 2 years, that just became not viable. There's not enough to catch up with it. So, and over time, and there's still a lot to be known about that. It's like.
Okay, I think Kurt had a question.
How high do you fly on your flights?
We fly 500 feet, 80 knots, and we fly in east-west. We fly the same route we've traditionally flown since the 80s. State flies at 700 feet sometimes, and at fixed wing, we use helicopter. So it's not really, we're not super comparable, but they're enough to at least get the general trends. And the distribution of that, especially in Banana River, is It's very wide open, very shallow along the edges. So when we fly our area, we're seeing almost all the water. But when you start flying like through these tributaries and stuff, overhanging grass, it's harder to see in those areas. But we fly 500 feet, 80 feet, fly every half degree all the way up through Banana River, and then have a certain path we follow there. And in Mosquito Lagoon, we basically follow along the edge of the shoal, because too close to shore, it's too shallow, or it's too shallow for most of the time for manatees to get there. It doesn't say they don't go in there, but from just, if you have to have parameters, you want to work, well, if it's half meter or less in depth, the manatee's a meter wide, it's the chances of them using that during good times would be less than when maybe now. When we're seeing this, we're seeing them going closer to shore because they have to get to the resources. But most of it just, we're trying to look at where the best distribution of seagrass is, and usually that's where the animals are, at least we're.
Well, I see the river every day, and I spend an awful lot of time on the river on weekends, either on my jet ski or in my boat, and I am definitely seeing more clarity now than we've seen in recent past. How does the clarity help you see the manatees as opposed to, and I understand if they're in the shallow water, you're going to see them.
Yeah.
That shadow is pretty distinguishable no matter how unclear the water is.
And that's a factor in when you do aerial surveys anywhere, and those are concerns. And as Martine and those guys talked about, over time, those methodologies have improved. But when you do that, for our surveys, and state probably does it to a certain extent, you want the best parameters, so you want the smoothest water. So if it's windy day, we have certain flight parameters. If it's over 10 or 15 mile an hour winds, which gets choppy, that decreases your sightability into that thing. Murkier water, which one thing we can't change is the water clarity, but we could influence how we do our survey. We don't do it on windy days, we don't do it on cloudy days, we don't do it during rain surge. So it's the best condition to get optimal things to do it. And then, of course, too, is the cadence of those doing as we repeat those. Traditionally, every 2 weeks during the summer, we don't do as much in the winter and fall as we have. It's something, actually, since the past couple of years, and we've seen things, we've increased flying around year-round to see if there's changes to other seasons. Because there's seasonalities to all this, but summer is the best way to look at the noise or the data from, you can compare summer to summer to summer to summer. So yeah, those are all factors, and we cite those. And when we do our surveys, like I said, we can't control the water clarity, so when we're flying along, we check, and every time we do observation, or if we see a change in water clarity, good, fair, poor, which when you're flying, if it's good means you can see the bottom clearly, and you can either see, sometimes it's really clear, you can see animals in there. And then fair is you can see the bottom, you can see outlines of seagrass and stuff. You can see things on the bottom, but you can't totally discern them, but it's still clear enough to see the bottom. And then poor is, it's a couple factors in that, is the water's just too murky, and that moves back and forth because during blooms, poor water you usually find over about 1.5 meters, and part of that's just a function of physics. Is the deeper it goes, it's harder to see the bottom, but it's more an environmental thing. We usually use that water clarity as algal blooms, etc. And so you see when there's blooms, our values for poor come closer to shore because it's more extent there, and even in shallow water, it's hard to see through cloudy waters. And so those are goes in factors. And we fly the survey and find that the water clarity has been too poor for the whole flight. We have the data, but we don't use that it doesn't meet the criteria, so it's available but embargo. But you try to have the best conditions, because the idea is to get the best relative abundance. We're not trying to get every nose and fluke out there, but you can't. But if you do over time enough systematically, you can at least get an idea of trends and changes in that. In data, that's why you have error bars and stuff on that.
How can you tell the difference between caulerpa and seagrass?
Well, that's all truth on ground. We just know that when we're flying, we go over, that's how we looked at this is, we use the assumption of this is the distribution of the seagrass bed for this year from the mapping efforts and our transects efforts. So we know what the extent of that is. And we spatially, when we fly, you can put our GPS point here, and then if you look at your maps, it's there. But so from there, we don't do that. But you can ground truth those, and then when you're in the field, during the mapping things, they truth that, and most of the time is on each one of these transects, you have by species and by percent coverage by species. So you identify each one. Clerk is a lot, really wide-bladed and long and really darker green kind of thing. Some of that, but it's a detached algae versus most of the traditional seagrasses such as haliduli and rupia are very thin blade type of seagrass. So visually you can see the difference when you're in the water doing the transects. So there's truthing points for transects and mapping.
I get that. I was just wondering how you were
No,
determining
no,
that from
we don't. We do not. The
500
assumption is,
feet up.
we don't do that. We just assumption you can just kind of see is we rely on the GIS data we have to spatially reference those. That if the map says it occurred during this time, and your points there, you assume that's what's in underneath there, and you can go back to that. So, it's
Because I see huge areas. I mean, huge areas where there's Clerpa.
Yep.
And, my hopes get sky high, and then I get in the water, and it's Clerpa.
Yeah.
But I haven't seen it, but I've been told that there's starting to be seagrasses growing up through the Clerpa.
And a lot of people, it's being seen by a lot of the seagrass people up and down the lagoon in there, and that's encouraging. But again, we saw some upticks one year, the next year we didn't. I mean, but you always have hope for this, and it's improving. And its biggest function is how long we have clear water for how long. I mean, Mosquito Lagoon was probably the clearest I've seen it in 10 years in the same area flying over it. I mean, and you can see, and it's really pretty. But then Banana River, we flew 2 weeks ago, right north of the 528. It was relatively clear, but there's reports of some blooms taking place, and you can see little red streaks in the water and stuff in areas, so you know that there's some events taking place there. So it's very ephemeral.
Well, the good news I can say is that despite all the wind that we've had recently and the rains, give the river a day or so and it's clear again. And I haven't seen that for a lot of years.
Okay, do we have one more question from Charlie, or are we good? Okay, thank you very much. And given that we do have 3 more presentations, I'm going to propose that we do keep pushing on if anyone needs to.
Chairman needs a break.
Huh?
The chairman needs a break.
Well, if anyone needs a break, we'll just step out. Is that okay? Or? Yep. Okay. Or do we want to take a break? No. Good? Keep going? Okay. Brevard Zoo Partnership for Manatee Rescue and Rehabilitation.
This one, right?
Yep.
Good morning. We're morning still? Yeah, we're morning. All right, so thank you guys for having me. I'm Jody Castle, Director of Conservation from Brevard Zoo. Although wildly passionate about manatees, not a manatee biologist. But going to talk to you guys today about what Brevard Zoo is attempting to do to help answer the call for manatees here in Brevard and surrounding counties. So as we just discussed, the unusual mortality event, the numbers the last 2 years have just been so high that although we have been extremely involved with helping with different rescues, transports, pieces like that with the fabulous partners that are doing manatee work, we wanted to do more. And being animal people that know how to give excellent animal care, we knew that we were in a location that we just could not deny being able to go out and assist and sort of take that next step, which has allowed us to enter this road into going into manatee rehabilitation. A little bit more about how we answer the call. You guys are all very aware of our oyster and clam work that we do. I did want to take a quick pause and go to Laura Lee's comment from earlier about the plastic, an update. The Restore Shores program, which falls under the Conservation Department at Brevard Zoo, we no longer use any plastics in our restoration methodologies in Brevard. So just to get that information out there. We have historically, but we have transitioned to all gabions and hoping to get into mostly corrals, which are still man-made materials, but they are not plastic. It has caused our cost to go up 10 times, but it's expensive to do the right thing sometimes, and so that is where we are and what we're doing. So I wanted to stop there and update on that. Additionally, seagrass, we know we are not going to outplant our way out of what is going on in the lagoon right now, but, you know, that analogy about when's the best time to plant a tree. So we are attempting to do a small piece of seagrass restoration through the work of a nursery, which we have funding that we've gotten from the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program. And that nursery is actually just days away from opening. It is located down at the Hub SeaWorld property, and we have a large number of tanks down there that we're going to be growing, and that will be Brevard's first seagrass nursery. So excited to start. There are also 2 research tanks there that we're excited to offer the opportunity for our partners in education to be able to do different testing. So to start to get some of those grasses out into the lagoon and see what happens when we do transplant them. And then our most recent answer of the call, the Brevard the Manatee provisioning and rehabilitation. The last 2 years, we've helped partners at U.S. Fish and Wildlife and FWC with the manatee provisioning work that has happened. This past year, we provided over 35 volunteers, and I would say it'd be more, but the volunteers that signed up for every single day that they could, because it's a really, it's a really great effort to be out there doing this work. But they provided over 250 hours to the assistance and provisioning of the manatees, and so just being able to help be a part of that solution has been fantastic. My next slide, I believe, yep, these numbers are extremely wrong. I apologize. I sent this slide to Virginia on Wednesday, and I did not go back and update these rescue numbers to combine with another staff person. But over the years, we have assisted with 68 rescues at Brevard Zoo. That means that I'm sending out staff and volunteers that are trained to help with rescues. So that 4 is actually a 68. We have run 13 transports to move manatees around the state to different areas that they need to go, whether they're going from one rehab to another or to be released. We have provided over 150 volunteers and almost 1,000 hours to do this work. And so just being able to be there, and when FWC calls and says, hey, we need 7 people out at this boat ramp in 2 hours, and then we deploy a team. And that's been great, and it feels good, but it's not enough. Like, it's absolutely not enough, which is why we have gone to this next step, and we are putting in a manatee rehabilitation facility both at the zoo and then at the future aquarium. So the manatee rehabilitation facility at the zoo is going to be open and operational by the end of this year. It is a fairly small facility. It is an acute care facility. So in the manatee rehab world, you have acute care and critical care. The differences in that is the credentials for veterinarians, also the equipment that you have, and then the care that you're able to provide. In an acute care facility, we're going to be able to provide a place that the animals can have additional monitoring, put on extra weight, and then just waiting for the perfect conditions to be able to get them back out into the water. We're going to have 3 tanks. You can see them here. We're going to have 2 20 by 40 oval tanks, and then 1 20-foot diameter, 6-foot tank, which is actually being repurposed from our sea turtle rehabilitation because it just was not a really good fit for that. And so to be able to upcycle that tank definitely feels good as well. These are all going to be fiberglass. I've already begun hiring the team that's going to help to care for these animals. This money has come to us by way of the state and is being managed by FWC and FWRI. And we are doing a large amount of, so the design is done. We are doing the construction now, and like I said, we will be operational by the end of this year. Additionally, with those fundings, we are purchasing a transport vehicle. This will allow for us to go out, excuse me, and run all of our own transports. If there's a manatee that's in trouble, we can deploy staff to help complement the team at FWC to go out and lay eyes on those animals, see if they are a need for a rescue candidate, and then to be able to help to run them throughout the state. The really important reason why we are, I mean, other than being in Brevard, and as you hear these numbers of where the epicenter of where manatees are, the closest facility is SeaWorld, and they're always running at max capacity. They carry a huge amount of the load in the manatee rehabilitation world. The next closest facility is Jacksonville. So what we're going to do is we're going to reduce the animals' time in transport and get them into care immediately, and that really helps to reduce the number of mortalities that you're going to see. So to have that care right here close is going to be good for them. Estimated 2027 is whenever things are going to get really fun. That's whenever the aquarium hopefully will be opening, and we're going to have a critical care facility there. And I am going to, I know many of you have probably seen it, but I did want to stick the video on here for the flyover, and you'll be able to see where that manatee facility will lie within the aquarium plans. I have to give a shout out to all of the fantastic people that let us come out and work alongside of them. You've heard them referenced earlier today, but the Manatee Rescue and Research Partnership. It's a wonderful group, a collaborative group of all the folks that have manatees within their care, but also the different agencies that are doing work in manatee conservation. So, let's see if this plays. I was going to send the updated numbers but I was too nervous to make it that this might not work, so. It'll be nice. We'll be able to bring our Sea Turtle Healing Center, an additional facility forward-facing so that people are able to see what's going on. They'll actually be able to watch procedures happen on turtles. So we understand that the long game is essentially that we're trying to improve water quality and have an abundance of seagrass, but kind of our short game right now, because that is sort of how we have to play, is to try to provide this care for these animals that are in need. So while we're planting clams and oysters and seagrass, we're going to now be able to help care for these guys as well. So I'll take any questions anybody has.
Gary?
You gotta love our zoo. I mean, this has got to be the best zoo in the world. And thanks for a great presentation. So one question, are you going to be able to support necropsies? Or only?
So we currently have a necropsy suite in our veterinarian building now, and so we've offered that up to FWC for as they need to do them. The majority of them, well, not the majority, quite a few of them do go over to Martine at the Pathology lab in St. Pete, but not all animals have to go there, and so a lot of them are done right here locally, and so that is something that we are equipped to do, and we can do. Any animals that unfortunately will pass in our care, those will be decided upon by the MRP and FWC where they go. But we have the space to do those necropsies here, yeah.
Yeah, anecdotally, I've heard that there's like a shortage. We get deaths that don't get analyzed. So anything you can do to help, thanks.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Barbara?
I just want to say, can you hear me? I just want to say.
Is it not on?
I guess it's been on.
There,
Okay.
there.
I just want to say thank you for all you're doing.
Thank you,
I've watched
Barbara.
Jody grow over the years and expand her programs, and it's so exciting to see at the zoo. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's easy to do this work because I love it. Any other questions?
Any others? Okay,
Great.
thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Hold on. Yeah, and so Jacksonville is the closest one to the north. Is there a site south?
Miami does a small amount of manatee rehabilitation as well.
So you'd still have to
Yeah,
go
and then Tampa has a critical care facility.
3 hours, basically,
Yeah.
north or south.
Yeah, and depending on traffic in Orlando, I mean, an hour is maybe a,
Hour,
maybe how long they're in the
two.
car.
Yeah. And have you been to the Gumbo Limbo Sanctuary?
It's been years, yes. but I
Okay,
was
yeah, because
down there.
it sort of reminds me of a modern version of that, is what I would more,
Yeah.
yeah.
The whole premise of the aquarium is going to be based on the Space Coast, and so it's all the Atlantic Ocean, the Indian River Lagoon, and the St. John's. And so the designs, I mean, it's basically, it's just all Space Coast of Florida.
It's exciting.
Tell a great story, hopefully. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We've got Laura Lee out. I think we'll go ahead and take a few minute break. Let's do 7 or 8 minutes, and because I know this next is the glyphosate proposal, and so I want to make sure everybody's here for that. So let's do 7 or 8 minutes, about 10 till. Okay. Okay, thanks, everyone. Let's return the meeting to order, please. Okay, our next item is the glyphosate study proposal with Charlie Venuto. Okay, all, if we could return to order, please.
Thanks, Todd. And
yeah, I need a gravel.
Yeah,
Okay.
So we've had some great discussions today.
Okay, everyone, please.
Relative to where we are as far as the projects go, and I think there was some thoughts about, wow, look at how many things are in design now or are actually constructed. So we've done a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to nutrient removal. And I started thinking about, well, you know, while the nutrients are really key contributors to the degradation of the lagoon, there's a lot of other variables that are in play. And it just so happened today then we got to hear a study about glyphosates. And so it just kind of worked out. I had proposed putting this together, and Virginia got it on the agenda this month. So I just wanted to spend a few minutes, literally, just going over this. You know, glyphosates are banned or restricted in several municipalities and counties, cities within Florida. You can look at the list. I don't need to read it to anybody here, but I think it's noteworthy that Satellite Beach is one of these municipalities. So that doesn't mean you can't use the glyphosate in that area, but the county and city governments have decided to put a prohibition and or a restriction on their use as for the government and probably, I presume, their contractors. So that tells you something. There's this many counties, and they go, you know, or areas throughout Florida, you know, pretty much throughout the peninsula. But if you look at this from a countrywide or a worldwide, there's many other states, cities, counties, and countries, especially in Europe, that have taken a harder look at glyphosates. Well, we also already got to see a diagram of the molecule today, but I did want to bring out some of the scientific literature concerns that have been brought up with this material. It looks like it's a potential human carcinogen. It's a well-known eye and skin irritant. It's associated with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And the other thing that really got my attention, there's been lawsuits that have been awarded up to $200 million, primarily for those who applied the material, where they get damage to their health. The original manufacturer, Monsanto, has settled 100,000 lawsuits and paid out $11 billion. I kind of found that chilling, that there's that many lawsuits out there. So I don't think those are all frivolous lawsuits. But there's also a lot of money behind that. And I don't know how they're structured, if they're self-insured, they got an insurance company. But that's a lot of money, which tells me there's really a lot of money to be made for this type of material. So got to know what you're dealing with. But it goes back to the essence, too, of the chemical makeup. There's phosphate in this. And that's one of the issues that we've been concerned about in this committee. So how does it operate? And I think you heard a much better explanation than what I'm going to provide you today, but I'll give you the broad overview, is that it's a nonspecific toxin. So, you know, we get to call things herbicides or pesticides or insecticides or rodenticides or fungicides. So there's two commonalities in those terms. One, it starts out with a biological position, you know, herbicide, being a herb, and then cide, which means killer, death. So all these things are killers. So I refer to them as biocides because there's really no pesticide or insecticide that's that specific to any one target organism. And so although this material is targeting plants, it does target broadleaf plants, so it's not specific to anything in particular, so it's fairly broad range as far as that goes. And when you apply to an open area, it opens up that area for invasive species. And, you know, Florida is kind of the epicenter, at least in the continental United States, for invasive species. So when we open these areas, like if you look on going on I-95, if you look on most sides, mostly you're going to see Brazilian pepper where that area was disturbed as part of the construction projects. So, you know, again, so when you use this material, it opens up to non-native plants, which aren't good for the lagoon. And then shoreline application that material that dies, the plants that die, they end up decaying. Well, they end up perhaps into the waterway, so they release their nutrients. They consume oxygen, so it lowers the dissolved oxygen and make it more difficult for aquatic organisms. So use of these type of materials by waterways is also not beneficial and not helping us with our goal. So the evidence on toxicity is becoming stronger and stronger. The study from 2020 goes through and tells you about all the different potential effects it has. And there's not too many metabolic systems that it seems to be missing. So everything from being a teratogen, which means it can harm the embryo and a pregnant woman, it can have cellular effects. That means getting down to your DNA and RNA, mitochondria within your cells, cardiovascular, carcinogenic, digestive. So it's pretty inclusive. So a material that's supposedly only an inhibitor to certain enzymes or functions within plants seems to have a lot of other unintended consequences. So, when I look at things, I've always tried to take it cautiously, or making sure that what we're doing is not going to harm, just like a doctor does, do no harm. And I think when you have some uncertainty about a material or about a process or a system, you want to take a safe approach. And, the burden shouldn't be on us to have to prove that something is hazardous. It really should be on the provider, the manufacturer, the seller of this material. I think we need to flip the script on how we look at these things. So, can we find alternatives? Can we find better materials or better actions so that we don't harm the environment and the Indian River Lagoon in particular? So there's just some questions to ask. But what I'd like to recommend is that, we heard on the mechanical harvesting today and how well that's doing. It's got a great ratio of nutrient removal to cost, and that was one of the things that sold us on it when we approved it or recommended for approval in our committee. But the other part of that was that, we don't have to use insecticides, and everybody said, yeah, that's great. Herbicides. But we never really got into the depth of that, I don't think, about how much, we're using. So I'd like to propose that our Brevard County government look into how much are we using of these glyphosate compounds? How much Roundup, how much rodeo? Let's understand where we're at. Maybe it's not an issue. Maybe we only use a couple ounces a year. Maybe we use hundreds of pounds. But I think it's something we should understand and try to look at what other cities are doing. Again, maybe starting with Satellite Beach, since they have been able to get away from it. And what are their success stories and their failures? What can we learn? What lessons learned can we obtain by seeing what other areas are doing? And maybe we can reduce the use of glyphosates and take that one variable out of the equation to helping with the lagoon to recover.
Okay.
Questions?
Are you going to chair the committee?
I'll be glad to do whatever it takes.
Well, step up. Who better than you?
Probably a lot of people, but I don't know how the inventory system for the county works, but I presume that somebody knows how much they buy and how much they use and how much is in stock. It's kind of the minimal type of inventory management system that county probably has. Starting with that, and then we can try to see what we do and maybe partner with, like I said, starting with Satellite and moving on.
So if I get you that information, then you'll be chair.
Sure.
So,
Okay, there you go.
Can I make a motion that we move forward with Charlie's proposal?
Second.
Ask for a second.
Well, okay, I have a motion and a second. I'll open the floor for continued discussion.
I guess I'm not really clear what the proposal is. I know he wants to try to inventory how much is being used.
Create a baseline.
Right, establish a baseline,
Yeah.
and then I think, I don't know what the magic number might be, Vinny, of 100 pounds, 20 pounds, but then based on that, maybe take that back to the committee here and say, hey, okay, we're using this amount. Should we start looking at and partnering with other, other government agencies and entities and see what they're doing? See if we can do something. We don't even need that. I mean, we should probably start doing that in parallel so we can be a little bit smarter and have some alternatives available if we decide to do something different than we're doing now.
Okay, so it would be to get a baseline, obviously, of what's being used, in the county.
Yeah, I think we need to start with that. I think we need to know where we're at before we can go someplace.
Okay.
Okay, do I have other comments and discussion, Bobby?
Is this just the county official itself or the overall county?
I think only the governmental part of it, because that's where all those other restrictions and bans have been able to take place.
But we'll be asking municipalities, other municipalities to participate,
It would be great to have them as well.
thinking that
you know.
that information, I would imagine it's readily available.
Especially, Malvern, Titusville, Cocoa, the bigger areas. And
Other comments?
Cape Canaveral has also written it into their comprehensive plan to discontinue glyphosate completely. So Zach Eichels is someone that worked with, you might want to reach out to. First, I just want to say thank you, though, for putting this together and bringing it forward and packaging it in a way that is understandable for the community. I know that there's a lot of concerns in our community about glyphosate use, and that's excellent that you've addressed that and acknowledged that, first of all, so thank you. Also, just in his Dominic's report that he gave earlier today, the cost per pound on the mechanical harvesting projects was at $68. And the only other two that I caught that I remember off the top of my head were closest next one was 105 for education, and then the septic to sewer conversions were over 200 per pound, if I recall that correctly. So it is a very economical process. And then also just one more note, I did work with the city of Melbourne last year or 2 years ago to try and transition a lot of their ditches that they're spraying. And they were very interested in being able to do that. It wasn't cost effective at that time. So there is a lot of community support. And as Lorraine mentioned, other municipalities that would want to be involved and help address this and provide data, I definitely know that it's out there. So however I can be of help and support with our state group as well that does the fertilizer campaigns through IFAS, I would love to. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kimberly, co-chairperson.
Okay. I would do that.
I know you
don't
would. Thank you.
accept things.
Thanks for your kind words, too.
Okay, do I have other comments, Lauren Lee?
That was really good, Charlie. I appreciate that. So, when you looked at the slides that Doug had for the manatees around the Space Center, and you look at the difference between Mosquito Lagoon and the Northern Banana River, and then we know what's going on in the Northern Indian River, there's no seagrass coming back. Yet, in Mosquito Lagoon, where you have no wastewater treatment plants, no septic tanks, no stormwater going into it, no herbicides going into it, the seagrass has come back on its own. We haven't had to plant a blade of grass, and there's seagrass everywhere in the Southern Mosquito Lagoon. I mean, and I've never seen so many manatees. I mean, normally we'd have about 500 manatees here in the summertime. We got twice that many, almost 1,000 manatees on their last flyover. So it's obvious that if we don't put stuff in the lagoon, it will come back on its own. But I think it's good that we figure out how much impact the herbicides do have, because they're not going into Mosquito Lagoon, Southern Mosquito Lagoon, but they are going into the Northern Indian River Lagoon. I don't know about the Northern Banana River. I don't know how much herbicide use there is out on the Kennedy Space Center. But, something's different between Banana River, Northern Indian River, and Southern Mosquito Lagoon. And the difference is that we're not putting stuff into Mosquito Lagoon.
Okay, do I have other comments?
So, yeah, I guess I've heard that we haven't been testing for glyphosate so much in terms of what's in the water and or muck. I guess we could view this as a more cost-effective option to try and get some sort of idea of how much of that is going on in the lagoon at the moment.
Yeah, Eric, I think that's, it's a good starting point, and then we can get a better idea of perhaps the scope of what we're dealing with. Like I said, it may turn out we're using very little, and then maybe that's not an issue. We can turn ourselves attention to other things. But I think we just need to get that data point.
One more thing to follow up with what Lorelei was saying about the concentrations. Even just today in the presentation where they showed the effects, I don't remember which presenter it was, the effects on the roots. and with the rhizome and the way the seagrasses grow. And so even that bounce that originally first the seagrasses came back, and then the next time that they died off, they haven't come back, that rhizome damage, that root, that holding in. When manatees feed, excuse me, even though they've been mislabeled as the cause of the seagrass being gone, it's a combination. They cohabitated for quite a while. But the rhizome being damaged, as they dig in, they eat similar to a goat. I don't know if anyone has ever seen that, but a goat will take out the entire root system. They're not a grazing animal. So as food becomes more depleted, and then they're going in there harder, and they're taking that damaged rhizome out. So while glyphosate kind of in a first study didn't show as direct damage to the manatees and mortality rates, there is, secondary causes that glyphosate is definitely connected to that. I mean, anyone here on this committee, that especially those of us that have lived here and used this lagoon lifelong have seen that it's an obvious correlation. We just don't have the exact reasons why. So starting with numbers and how much is being used, I think is excellent.
Yeah, and I'd like to add, I very much appreciate how you've presented this. For me, there's some more complicated pieces to it, such as the highlighting of mechanical harvesting as compared to this issue. So for me, I struggle a little bit with this because, I mean, I know we had a lot today on glyphosate, I can't even say it. And I'm struggling to know exactly what we're proposing, how it fits with the committee, how it fits with the rest of our plans. So I know personally, I'm not necessarily opposed to doing something of this nature, but I feel like at some level we need to draw that really close conclusion into, our enabling ordinance, our charter, how it relates to the plan, which does have some specific focus on nutrient removal. I think you did a good job on that, of tying it back to that issue of that if we're killing vegetation, that is then decaying. So I guess my only concern about taking a motion and approving today is that for me personally, I would like to see some more specificity on our specific objectives, how it ties into the plan, what our purpose is, how we're going to deploy it effectively, what that looks like, whether it's a committee function here or, and all of those additional details. So that is my concern about taking, because just taking a motion here today and just moving forward and with what I see as a good concept and something that has merit, but that may have more breadth to it than just 3 or 4 bullets. So that would be my concern with adopting a motion today. So for me personally, I think it's something that would have a lot of merit to come back with some refinement of the specifics on how it ties to that committee, those plans, all of those pieces, and more specificity on exactly what it looks like coming forward.
So I think you're right on to be concerned about the sort of open-ended, mission creep kind of thing. I would offer a modification to limit the study to the gathering of the data, how much is actually being used, as a stepping stone perhaps to then expanding that to more, but I think having the data, just as Eric pointed out, to me it's a cheaper way of getting a baseline, much less expensive than going out and trying to sample the IRL for how much is out there. So that would be my, I don't know if I need to phrase that or if you need to rephrase it.
The motion is just for a baseline. The motion I made was just
gathering
for
the
that.
data.
Just to gather the data,
Okay.
create a baseline. And the reason I think I understand your concerns, but I feel like we can easily move forward on this. We've already taken, we've already moved with the mechanical harvesting. So we've already spent significant amount of dollars on that. And this is very much connected to the positive results of that. So I don't feel like it's out of the blue, and just to get the data as a baseline is a pretty preliminary step, anything beyond that, we could easily elaborate more on how it's tied to our mission and that sort of thing, but I don't feel like it should be that big of a step that it takes us away from our charter.
And I think, Lorraine, to prove that it is just cause, I don't think you were saying it wasn't, just more inquisitive. We're funding to take the nutrients out of the lagoon. So if we have municipalities or entities that are coming in asking for funding to pay to take their nutrients out of the lagoon, and they're going back and internally in their budgets are approving hundreds of thousands of dollars more for glyphosate spraying, when more than ever it is economical and financially viable to substitute with the mechanical harvesting, maybe even cost effective. That's, as kind of a give and take there where, we could even move into a proof that there isn't, more contaminants being put in or more biocides. I love that, by the way, the biocides is perfect. Being put into the waterways, direct spraying. I'm not talking about like field management. I'm talking about direct spraying to remove and kill vegetation in ditches, hundreds of miles of ditches. I would venture to say thousands in the county. I don't have that number, but I just know Melbourne's numbers and off that. So it is a huge thing. And as far as Satellite Beach going too, I had a huge impact on that. And I want to say that they started with this exact conversation that we're having here today. And they did move into discontinuing glyphosate use from the city, from their community garden. And then that turned into the whole city initiative, which in turn went to their plastics and everything else. So I think it was a huge catapult. And again, R&D, that's great. Let's look at some numbers and see where that leads into. But I think it's an obvious step that, Charlie, thank you again so much for bringing and taking the time to do a formal presentation about this subject today.
I appreciate that. I'm supportive of data collection. I think, just in your conversation, you said that you differentiated use in fields versus direct spray and ditches. I don't know that I heard that we're able to differentiate that in this data request. So for me, I'm supportive of us, of this, figuring out what this data might look like. I just feel like we need some refinement in order to effectively vote on it, to say, what is that proposal? Because what I see is I've already heard multiple comments from the committee that, to me, it doesn't have adequate refinement to know what we're looking for exactly. So I would be entirely supportive of this if it came back and said, here's what this benchmarking looks like, here's the proposal, here's how we would get the level of granularity so that we have complete expectation of success of truly getting what we want so that we can apply it to our mission. That's my only concern, is not any opposition to this data collection, but simply getting that adequate level of granularity so that we know what we're proposing and that we have every expectation that if we spend any money, or certainly as we spend time, that we think we're going to be successful in getting data that's going to be supportive of making effective decisions.
And Todd, so can I make a recommendation? Because I struggled the same way, asking what was the proposal. I think, Charlie, I think you, and I don't mean to throw this on you like you do the work, but I did the marketing. I did the thermometers way back when. But I just think that something like this is something that any committee member could call municipalities, request how much they're giving. I don't necessarily know if it requires a motion of our group to do, or some behind the scenes work where a committee member or whatever finds out how much is being spent. And then I do like Kimberly's idea, although it feels kind of like a marketing thing where, we tell people you don't need fertilizer because there may already be enough nutrients in the groundwater. And so what we're doing is we're more educating, you don't need to spend this amount to get the same result. And so, Kimberly, if what you're saying is if municipalities are spending this much on glyphosate, and we can go back and say, but look, mechanical harvesting only costs this amount, that to me is more of an educational and a communication.
Absolutely.
Which I love. I've been asking Virginia, how can we, Danny's back here, I told her, we'll give Melbourne another harvester, what can you do with it? And she's like, yeah, give it to me. Because I think we all know mechanical harvesting, it would be more ideal. The question is how do we get that into the cities? And so my recommendation, I love this, Charlie, and I think it's great, and I think all of us have this ability in us to go find this data and bring it and then propose a further step. I just don't necessarily know if it needs a motion, if that's something that you'd be
Can I
willing.
just
I already
say-
heard you were voluntold to, or you volunteered to go ahead and get this data. I know, I'd love to see the data.
Okay, sorry. Lorraine?
Yeah, just to say, and even as a council member in COCO, I can tell you, just one of us randomly going to the municipalities and trying to get this data is going to be a pretty inefficient way to do it, and that you're going to have a low response rate. That's just the reality.
I have
Are
a
we
tendency
looking
to agree, and.
Are we looking for just county, though? County data for
Yeah,
our
so-
purposes?
County data.
So it would just be one source point, I
So-
believe, for now, initially.
We do have a motion and a second. I would like to propose a friendly amendment that says that we agree that we want to move forward with this, but that we would like a final proposal with the details to come back at a subsequent meeting for final approval before we start issuing these requests.
Would staff be able to provide that at the next meeting? Is that something?
Provide what?
A final
A
proposal?
more detailed approach of what this would include, or what our
Do you
objective
want us
is.
to work with Charlie?
Yes,
to
please.
Come up with what is viable?
A
to
refined
collect?
proposal on the specific objectives and
Okay, and we'll put
Data
this
requests.
on the July agenda, to come back in July.
Yeah,
And we can
because we're
reach out
already-
to
we're-
Satellite
we're
Beach
2 months now.
and Zach and Cape Canaveral, and,
Satellite Institute policy.
right, and get their lessons learned. I would like to just, even though mechanical harvesting is cost-effective in terms of ways to reduce nutrients going to the lagoon, in the lagoon, compared to, other projects in the plan, it's not cheaper than spraying, right? So I think we were talking about the cost effectiveness of cleanup project opportunities, and then that got translated into the cost
Maintenance.
of harvesting versus spraying, and that's not.
Right, and
the
I
same.
was also equating the value of prevention. So if we're continually chasing our tail because we're continuing to pollute and create that muck and that legacy load, as opposed to preventing it. And mechanical harvesting also has a lot more data that shows that the follow-up is less frequent. So where the spraying, actually you're going back there and spraying continually because it's causing growth, as opposed to the mechanical harvesting. And it does require a sophisticated management. I mean, you do have to remove the vegetation and dispose of it properly if it's contaminated. I mean, there is a huge tier of qualifiers there that need to be put into practice. And definitely what you say, that first cost effectiveness versus the overall value is a factor that has to be addressed.
Just while we're on this topic, the original plan did not include vegetation harvesting. Everything that was in the plan was something like a stormwater pond where you dig it and it's going to work for decades, right? It's going to get you that annual benefit year after year after year after year with very low maintenance costs. The mechanical harvesting dollars, that's the benefit when you do that harvesting, right? It's what you take out of the water. It's a one-time benefit. It's not a recurring annual benefit. So it's not directly comparable, sorry, to
And
the
again,
other
frequency.
costs in the plan.
Frequency does play a factor in cost and value, and it is very sophisticated tier. And there is a lot of data statewide, and it was mentioned several times internationally. The data is decades old. I mean, these 11, or what was it, 100,000 plus cases that have already been settled. I mean, those span back years, decades. So there is data there that does exist to show proof for, at least R&D on the subject, which whether it's a motion or just internal, we get numbers and go from there. I think it's a great start.
So I think, as we talked, our program's really matured, and again, demonstrated by the conversation Dominic had in his presentation. So my thought is that we need to, as we mature, we need to look at things a little bit differently, and having this discussion today, I think, has been very, fruitful, and I think, working with Virginia staff and with the county to figure out, where we're at with this, and then we have some data, just some preliminary data that we can come back to and say, well, should we pursue this? So I'm good with that, with the conversation we've had and this kind of limited motion.
Okay.
So to clarify, do you accept the amendment to come back with a more detailed plan before we extend this?
Regrettably, it's a 2-month delay, but.
Okay, and do you accept that as far as your second?
Sure.
Okay, so we now have an amended motion and a second related to collecting this data, but coming back in 2 months to provide a more detailed assessment of our objectives and the specific data collection expectations. Any further discussion?
Would that also include some more info from the places like kind of relatable would be Martin County and River County that you said have already done this? Do we got?
I see that could be part of the plan. That's the more specificity that I would be looking for to say what you're wanting to do, because I don't know in the next 60 days that they're going to be able to collect all that data.
Yeah, I think within that scope, we could certainly talk to the Cape Canaveral as well as Satellite Beach, kind of use those as our stepping stones for then reaching out to Martin County or Jacksonville.
Even if just maybe the dates of when they did that as well.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a motion and a second. We've completed discussion. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Oh, excuse me, I missed public comment. So since we're taking an official motion, I will accept public comment on this. Do I have any? Okay, hearing no public comment, I'll do that again. I have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All opposed, like sign. Passes unanimously. So with that, we will move on to our program video, Aquatic Vegetation Management, Transitioning from Herbicides to Harvesting, a very appropriate and timely discussion. And you do have the team here as well that I think are also able to answer any of the questions that may come.
Yeah, so while Logan pulls up that video, I'll just say that this is the vegetation harvesting team, so they're here if you have questions after the video.
And additionally, just before we run that, we are at about 11:25. We do have several public comment cards, so we're going to run a little past 11:30. I would ask for a motion to extend the meeting by 15 minutes,
So
please.
moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Passed unanimously. We have 11:45 closing time. Okay.
Hello, I'm Raleigh Berry, Senior Environmental Scientist with the Brevard County Natural Resources Management Department. In this presentation, I'll share some of the lessons we've learned during the ongoing development of our Aquatic Vegetation Management Program. My target audience includes any group interested in transitioning primarily from herbicides to harvesting. Although the scale and specifics of our programs may differ, several common traits will apply to both. With that in mind, let's set the stage. As a general rule, after herbicide treatment, aquatic vegetation is left in place to decay. The immediate local impacts of the decay process include an increase in biological oxygen demand and sediments. At the same time, nutrients and organics are also released downstream. Two watersheds divide Brevard County, the St. Johns River watershed in the west and the Indian River Lagoon watershed in the east. Several years ago, we had an opportunity to secure grant funding to address water quality in the Indian River Lagoon. This funding allowed us to launch our aquatic vegetation harvesting program, which began operation as a pilot project in May 2019. The objective during this initial phase was to remove aquatic weeds from 30 stormwater treatment and conveyance ponds. The selected ponds were scattered throughout the county and included sites adjacent to schools, parks, farms, and residential communities. Site access at stormwater ponds is often complicated by steep embankments, trees, and other obstacles, close proximity to fences, potential damage to conveyance structures, and the need to avoid turf damage in adjacent residential lots. Additionally, water depth in many ponds can be very shallow. These factors guided our equipment selection. Target vegetation was another consideration in equipment selection. We anticipated harvesting mostly emergent vegetation, chiefly cattails, and floating vegetation, chiefly water lettuce. In order to harvest cattails, the equipment would require some form of cutting mechanism, and in order to harvest water lettuce, we believed the equipment would require a perforated bucket. Historically, equipment designed to harvest aquatic vegetation was intended to clear waterways for boating and was scaled accordingly. However, many of our ponds have a footprint of only a few hundred square feet. Equipment size was therefore a major factor guiding our selection. Taking the above factors into consideration, we decided to select an amphibious aquatic harvester, which can be thought of as a hybrid between a front-end loader and a pontoon boat. Tank-like treads provide mobility on land and also serve the function of paddle wheels in the water, and a variety of attachments allow for cutting and collection of aquatic vegetation. We anticipated staging harvested vegetation along pond embankments to allow for modest dewatering, after which we plan to use a skid steer to load the material into trucks equipped with dump beds for transport. We believed 2 employees would suffice for harvesting operations, an equipment operator for the harvester and skid steer, and an unskilled assistant. Note that the modified pickup trucks we initially selected did not require a CDL. As an afterthought, we added a mini excavator to our equipment inventory, anticipating it would be of some use in narrow areas inaccessible to the amphibious harvester. During the 6 months of our pilot phase, we harvested roughly 152,000 pounds of vegetation from the 30 ponds. Our efforts resulted in the removal of 284 pounds of nitrogen and 39 pounds of phosphorus, and we deemed our pilot phase to be a success. Beginning in 2020, we entered into a remediation phase, which is currently underway. In this phase, our objective is to render each site suitable for an anticipated maintenance phase yet to come. To date, during this remediation phase, we have harvested an additional 2.8 million pounds of vegetation, which resulted in the removal of 5,464 pounds of nitrogen and 585 pounds of phosphorus. And now, an example. Remediation is intended to address site conditions outside the scope of routine maintenance. This pond, suffering from years of neglect, was entirely covered by a floating tussock, a situation we did not anticipate when selecting equipment. Initial work at this location consisted of clearing the periphery of the pond with the excavator. Next, the harvester traversed the floating tussock, breaking it into manageable segments, and was then used like a tugboat to slowly propel those segments to the excavator waiting on shore, which will remain stationary nibbling away at that tussock. Maneuvering the tussock proved glacially slow because the harvester's tracks generated scant thrust. Before we leave this image, note the standard bucket on the excavator, which is ill-designed for harvesting aquatic vegetation. Moving forward, we are in the process of acquiring rakes specifically designed to harvest aquatic vegetation. We anticipate a 3-fold increase in efficiency when using our excavator. While the amphibious harvester is indispensable in many circumstances, its intrinsic limitations of thrust and speed have prompted us to investigate alternatives. Moving forward, we plan to augment our equipment inventory with a shallow draft workboat. These units share the basic functionality of an amphibious harvester, but replace track paddles with outboard engines. A note on equipment before we move on: be sure to consider the availability of replacement parts during the selection process. We discovered early on that harvesting will always vastly outpace transportation. As I mentioned, we initially purchased 2 pickups equipped with dump beds. Each has a carrying capacity of 2.9 cubic yards. During our 2021 fiscal year, staff made 252 round trips to transport vegetation off-site. We are in the process of expanding our transport fleet to include 2 medium-duty flatbed dump trucks, each with an 8.6 cubic yard carrying capacity, which will require a CDL with an air brake endorsement. Had these been in use during fiscal year 2021, those 252 trips would have been reduced to 85, and the required staff time would have been reduced from 375 down to 125 hours. All of our harvesting equipment has hydraulic components, and no matter how well maintained, hydraulic equipment is likely to leak at some point. In our case, this occurred 2 months into our pilot phase. Fortunately, our staff has HAZWOPER training at the operations level, or better, and we were able to mobilize the minimum required 4-person emergency response team to contain, report, and clean up our small spill. And that brings us to our final lesson learned. Here we see staff venturing into a pond filled with water lettuce. Safety is a factor in equipment operation of any form, with special concern in water bodies. Given to employees, if one is transporting vegetation off-site, then the other would be working alone. We realized almost immediately that this was a safety concern and made certain that someone would always be present while equipment is in use. Thus, in our case, a minimal team must consist of 3 employees, not 2, as we initially planned. Moreover, we've realized that these employees must be capable of operating equipment interchangeably. We are currently expanding our program to include a second team of 3 employees, allowing us to transition fully from remediation to maintenance, including the need to address ponds within Brevard's western watershed. And finally, a summary. Select harvesting equipment based on target species. Scale equipment selection to typical site conditions. Consider availability of repair components. Prior to routine maintenance, sites may require additional effort. Do not underestimate the logistics of off-site transport. Assure that staff is prepared to respond to emergency situations. Carefully evaluate minimal staffing requirements. Aquatic vegetation harvesting has unique safety concerns. Thank you.
Great job. Okay, thank you. Any questions on the program or the team?
I think that would serve as an excellent first data set for what we could move to. Thank you, County. Thank you, everyone in Virginia who's been a part in that. That's amazing, and it's really exciting to see that your case study actually could be used as a template for other municipalities, counties, state. It's excellent work, and it's definitely, as someone who studies this as a hobby, it's phenomenal. Thank you.
Absolutely, I completely agree. That and when I talk about coming back, that's kind of some of those pieces that we may want some additional data so that we're not singularly focused in our data collection activity. So things of that nature to pair a more comprehensive approach, I think, is really the direction that I was intending. Any additional comments, Bobby?
First, I saw a lot of manatee food being thrown away there. I'm kidding, I think. But I just, I'm really excited to see you answered one of my questions in the video, like why don't you have one of the big bucket rakes for the front end loader? I've said that to people here for so many projects, not county, but all over. Why don't we use those in Florida? They have them out Midwest and the farms for the ditches on the road, but you don't very seldom see that in this state at all. So that made me really happy to see that you've already got one on order. And 2 questions. Why do you think there was I saw a huge amount in Wickham Park collected. Why do you think that might be? And have you thought about a dump trailer with, as well as maybe just a dump truck? And
Yes, is this working? We have considered a dump trailer, but site access is one of the driving forces. And some of our locations are so tight that it wouldn't be practical for us to use that. The size and legacy load of vegetation in the stormwater ponds and the park ponds varies wildly from site to site, and that's why you saw so much at the Wickham location.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and you dewater? Do you dewater the vegetation?
Yes, the vegetation isn't moved off-site until at least 2 days have elapsed in order to allow the modest dewatering and whatever little critters we've picked up an opportunity to move back into the ponds.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much for your work.
Thank you.
And with that, we will move on. We have no old business, no new business, and so I'll move on to general public comments. And I'm having trouble reading this last name. Jesse, is it Wales?
Yes.
And you'll have 3 minutes.
All right, hi guys. Thank you for having me. My name is Jessie Wales. I'm with the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program, and I just wanted to comment on Laura Lee's concerns with local captains having issues with plastic in Mosquito Lagoon. I've worked extensively with University of Central Florida and Marine Discovery Center on their oyster restoration and shoreline restoration projects. I'm very happy to say that they are no longer using plastic moving forward. They have transitioned over to non-plastic alternatives. Now, in addition to that, they are also taking out all of the derelict plastic mats that are no longer working up in Mosquito Lagoon. So a lot of the work that they did last year and this year is taking out those mats, putting in new oyster reef restoration methods, and starting the monitoring process all over again. So that takes time, right? I think they did about 5 sites last year, and they're going to continue that work this year. So it's not going to be done in one summer, unfortunately, but it is in the process of getting rid of all of that excess plastic. So just wanted to say that, yeah.
Having started my career in environmental recovery, drilling oyster shells to attach to those mats.
Yeah.
What do you mean when you say derelict mats that are no longer working? What's happened to the mats?
So the plastic mats are made out of an Naltex mesh, which is a marine grade mesh, and oyster shells were attached onto them using zip ties. Those mats were put out onto degraded oyster reefs that had been raked back down to elevation and kept in place with cement rings. Over time, those grew oysters very, very well. We do have an issue with boring sponge in Mosquito Lagoon. So what was happening was that original shell was being weakened by boring sponge. And as boat wakes continued to come in, it would eventually break that original shell off of the oyster mat, rolling the cluster above high tide and creating the same issues we had in the past with dead margins. So what we've been seeing is just a bunch of plastic mats with zip ties on them and no live oysters. So on those reefs, we are actively going in, taking them out, and replacing it with one of 3 methods, either a biodegradable oyster mat that's made from potato starch with drilled oyster shells connected using stainless steel zip ties. We are using a cement jute method, which are created into these oyster patties, we call them, made with a quick-set cement that has a neutral pH that attracts oysters. Or we are also working with galvanized metal to create oyster bags at the toes of the reef. We are monitoring it, and everything is working just as well as those plastic mats did. So we're pretty excited about that.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for addressing that.
I just want to say what a nice job you did on that horseshoe crab piece on Channel 9 a couple of days ago.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so.
My mother saw it, and she was so excited, and she called me up, and I was able to go online and find it.
Yes, so thank you. I appreciate that. WFTV.com. I just did a piece on horseshoe crabs in Mosquito Lagoon and how important they are to the ecosystem, their nesting patterns, and it was really fun to do that. So,
excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you. My next is Stell Bailey.
Hello, I am Stell Bailey from Cocoa, Florida. I'm also the executive director of a nonprofit called Fight for Zero, where we work on environmental health. I'm a nationally recognized environmental health advocate. I literally just got back from Washington, D.C. this week. I want to say how refreshing it is to see these presentations today about the manatees, but especially about glyphosate, because one of my biggest passions is the impact of pollution on human health. We talked about glyphosate and how it breaks down quickly. The one thing that doesn't break down quickly is PFAS, also known as perfluorinated compounds. It is one of the subjects that I am very passionate about. That's what I was in Washington, D.C. advocating for our veterans and our firefighters who are exposed. We had 3 active installations here in Brevard County, NASA, Patrick, and Cape, who used AFFF, which is a firefighting foam that got into the Indian River Lagoon. We know that this bioaccumulates, it uptakes in seagrass, so it is also impacting seagrass. Manatees have 43 times higher PFAS than the green sea turtles. We also know I work with the University of Florida, a team that is taking surface water samples. We're wrapping up a 3-year study to see how that is moving through storms. They also have taken samples from seagrass. They've also done it from the wildlife's blood. They found the highest levels in the wildlife's blood here on Florida's Space Coast than they have ever found with fluorinated compounds. I guess my point is glyphosate is just the beginning of this, and I brought my children today because this is something that impacts them. They had to watch me, their mother, go through cancer, but also their grandfather, but also their uncle, and also our family dog, all in the same year. And it is documented in my medical records that it was environmentally caused and that I had no genetic mutations. So I really implore you to look into the glyphosate. It is a really important topic to our family, and we would really appreciate it if you guys started taking that direction. I really liked when someone said stopping the sources of pollution, because all of these amazing efforts that you guys are taking to clean up the lagoon, it won't be meaningful if we don't stop those sources. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was going to say this for my comments, but I would like to recognize the 2 youngest members of the audience I've ever seen here in 7 years of these commission meetings. This is Colleen and Connor Bailey. They're here of their own volition, not just because their mother is a pathfinder and fighter in this environment, but they're doing their own part. And I commend you, and I look forward to seeing your contributions in the future.
Okay, I've got one more comment, but I'll need a motion for another, for some more time. 10 minutes, please.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Passes unanimously. Our last public comment card, Denise Zach.
She's left.
She's left? Okay. Well, we maybe didn't need the additional time. I will open it up for committee comments.
I have some, so we might need the 10. No, I'll be quick, Todd, I'll be quick. But one thing
Let me start the timer.
Yeah, please start the timer. Give me 1 minute, I'll go fast. Laura Lee, thank you for bringing that up with the sea captains, because I know in the past, they may have felt that we do not hear them or are not listening to them.
That's exactly how they feel.
And so thank you, because I know as one, you probably get a lot of that heat. And so I did talk to some of our lovely members from the zoo in between our bathroom break. I'm glad I've got a big bladder. I didn't need to go. But I just wanted, I know, I'm sorry, big bladder. That's what I want everyone to take home from this. No, but so so what they were saying is they're recovering the plastics from the old mats, and so I think that's information that they probably don't know. I didn't know, and so I've gotten. The other thing is what Jody was telling me, I think, is their seagrass is really low, and so maybe it's not the zoo's seagrass, but other areas, and they do have reflective PVC or poles that they're putting up around it. But I guess my point is I think it would be great if you connected the people that come to you with concerns to the zoo or Jody or Jesse, because they can get that information out, and then hopefully that information, once given to them, can circulate. Because I think the problem is there's information that isn't known. And when you get with other people that don't know the information, it can turn into an echo chamber. So thank you very much for bringing that, because I do think they are a very important voice. And so I would, I asked Jody if she could handle that, and she said, yeah, sure. So I would definitely, connect them with her and Jesse, because if there is a problem, let's hear about it and let's work on it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
And then just real quick on that, because I know, again, talking to the zoo, I've worked with other municipalities, and I don't want to discourage anybody. I haven't had a problem getting any information, talking to any municipal city managers or town managers, and so I would encourage. Well, yeah, but it's not me, Lorraine. It can't be me. It can't be me. But I wouldn't want to discourage anybody in this committee. I think as part of the Citizens Oversight Committee, it's our job to reach out and to extend the arm of natural resources, and I haven't had a problem, but I haven't asked for glyphosate information, so maybe it's the information at hand.
Okay. Laura Lee?
So just building on the glyphosate comment, glyphosate, in addition to putting weird stuff in the water and killing plants and creating nutrients, it kills animals too. Last year there was a contractor that was spraying Brazilian pepper on the islands in Mosquito Lagoon, north of Haulover Canal. And so they sprayed the pepper trees on the island, and the next day there were hundreds of dead fish around the island, and dead stingrays and horseshoe crabs and blue crabs and every kind of fish you can imagine in a big circle around this island where they had just sprayed the glyphosate. And then there was another incident where, again, a fisherman reported it to me. This was down in the corner of the Pineda Causeway, the southeast corner of the Pineda Causeway. And contractor had been in there spraying Brazilian pepper again. And the next day, there were hundreds of butterfly rays upside down on the bottom of the river there. So it's really, there's more impacts than just the nutrients going into the water. They kill animals too.
Okay, any other committee comments before? And I would just like to add to that, I agree. I think, the comments and connection with the local governments, I do find most of them to be responsive. I think one of the challenges we have here is try to be very purposeful about our data collection as well. So making sure that by the time we get to that we're doing this, that we're doing it in a very concerted effort, so that again, we have an expectation of data that's going to be very effective and usable. So, having a well-aligned effort, I think, is very important. I think that's the other piece for me that's very clear, is there's so many interconnecting pieces to the health of the lagoon that, that's definitely a complicating topic of everything that we're trying to do with the plan as it lives today. So, with that, anything you'd like to add, Virginia? And our next meeting is in July, so there is no June meeting. And with that, we will be adjourned.
The opinions expressed by any member of the public during any period of public comment do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of the Board of County Commissioners of Brevard County, Florida, Space Coast Government Television, or the program sponsor, and are solely those of the presenter. The Board of County Commissioners of Brevard County, Florida, Space Coast Government Television, and the program sponsor hereby expressly disclaim any and all responsibility or liability for any defamatory or slanderous statements expressed by any member of the public during any such period.